Thank you.
FM, if you could start the webcast, please. Yeah, I can confirm we're now live, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So welcome everyone to our virtual meeting of the Children and Young People Select Committee. The meeting is being webcast on YouTube via the County Council website. I will begin by reading the names of the members on the committee so they can confirm their attendance for the public record. Members, please unmute and confirm your attendance when your name is called so we can ensure you can be heard. So firstly, myself, the Chairman, Councillor Kirsty North. We have our Vice Chairman, Councillor Ray Bolton.
Present.
Councillor Jackie Branson.
Present.
Councillor Anne Briggs.
Present.
Councillor Zilia Brooks.
Present.
Councillor Fran Carpenter.
Present.
Councillor Peter Edgar.
Present.
Councillor Powell Hare.
Present.
Councillor Wayne Irish.
Present.
Councillor Gavin James.
Present.
Councillor Neville Penman, who I'm aware is at the dentist. Councillor Jackie Porter.
Present.
Councillor Robert Taylor.
Present.
Oh, thank you. Councillor Malcolm Wade.
Present.
Councillor Michael Westbrook.
Present.
And Councillor Bill Withers.
Present.
And then Ian Bruton, our co-opted Parent Governor Member for Secondary Schools.
Present.
Thank you. And Gareth Davis, our co-opted Parent Governor Member for Primary Schools.
Present.
Thank you very much. We also welcome Councillor Patricia Stella, the Executive Lead Member for Children and Young People, Councillor Ros Chad, the Executive Member for Education and Skills, and I believe Councillor Judith Grayeski, Executive Lead Member for Public Health, is also with us. So other than Councillor Neville Penman, who is at the dentist having some emergency dental work, have we got any other apologies, please, Jackie?
No, I've had no other. Sorry, yes, we have had Rob Sanders and Kate Watson. My apologies. The co-opted Parent Governor members, they have given their apologies.
Thank you very much. Any other apologies from the floor? Perfect.
Kirsty, my name wasn't read. It's Councillor Boyles.
Councillor Boyles, are you deputising for anyone today, or as a deputy? You're very welcome to observe the call for the meeting.
I'll observe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. We'll move to item 2, declaration of interest. If members have any declarations in any item to be discussed today, can they declare it at the time that the item is being discussed? So we'll move to item 3, which are the minutes. You'll find them on your agenda pack of the meeting held on the 10th of January 2020. We will not conduct a poll for the minutes, so if you have any concerns, please unmute and let me know now. Give everyone a minute. I'm not hearing any dissent, so we will agree that the minutes are a true record and move on to item 4, which is deputations. We have 2 deputies today in relation to item 6 on the agenda, and I would like to welcome them both to the meeting. We have Mandy Adams from Compton and Shawford Preschool and Joanne Mahag from Kingsworthy Preschool. So we will invite Mandy Adams to speak first. You'll have 10 minutes to speak. And please go ahead when you're ready.
Chairman, before you start, just can I say I declare an interest. I'm a trustee of the preschool from which Joanne Mahag is talking.
Yes, thank you very much.
Chairman, my apologies for interrupting. We've had a bit of technical difficulty with Mandy on the line. I'm just trying to join her back to the meeting as we speak.
No problem at all. Okay, we will hang on.
Hello?
Hello, is that Mandy?
Yeah, hi, hello. It's not happening, is it? Keeps going dead.
Lovely. You're back joined in the meeting now, Mandy. So
okay,
if I hand
lovely.
you across to the chairman, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi Mandy, it's Councillor
Hi.
Kirsty North here. Thank you for deputising today for us. If you're ready, you'll have 10 minutes and you can start when you would like.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So I just wanted to bring about our problems we have with our preschool and some of the reasons perhaps why. So we are a semi-rural preschool in just outside Winchester and Compton, and we've been here for 40 years. And over the past 3 or 4 years, things have become very difficult. And last year we lost, just to give you an idea, we lost £12,000 ending August 2019, and we'll probably do the same this year, even with COVID. And that would mean that we would be closing next July. And well, some of the issues that we have is pretty much because the current funding system by the government, obviously, I know most places will tell you it's not enough, that it isn't actually enough, but it also has a one-size-fits-all approach, and every early years provision, more so probably than any other sector, is completely different. We all have different buildings, different rates, different rents, different operating systems, different management. So we're run by our parents and the committee. That can be hard to get people to join, but that's a totally separate issue. So with regards to funding, although the government funding is that you can have one adult to 8 children if they're over 3, and 1 to 4 if they're under 3, our problem is our environment. We need to have 3 members of staff as an absolute minimum on site, because the EYFS requirements are that children need to be within sight or sound of an adult at all times. Our layout doesn't allow for that. So if you're in the main hall, you can't see or hear what's going on in the toilets. And if you're in the garden, which is out the back of the building, which has no windows and no doors directly onto it, again, you can't see what's happening in the toilets or in the main hall. So we need 3 people to ensure that safeguarding happens and it's effective. So ultimately, although you can have 1 to 8, the reality is we have to have 24 children here at all times from beginning to opening to be able to break even. And as we're a small semi-rural setting, that's actually not possible. You know, we have some 2 years, 6 months that may only want to come for 3 hours a day, and we're open 5 hours a day. So as the day continues, we have children come in and children go in. So we don't ever meet full capacity every single hour of every single day. So we're always losing money. And obviously, 1 to 8 isn't quality in itself. You know, you cannot possibly be an educator, a facilitator, and a carer to 8 children at the same people. So even if we were able to have a 1 to 8 in every environment, the standard and the quality would be appalling. Most settings work with a much lower ratio. If we were a large nursery, we would have flexibility. We'd be able to move our staff around, have part-time staff as well as full-time staff. We've taken on apprenticeships. Apprenticeships tends to be, because we're a part-time local community preschool, we don't get apprenticeships come to. They're not interested. We can't give them enough hours, enough experience. So even if we try to get apprentices, it's something that hasn't worked in the past. Although we obviously are small, we're hugely important to our local community. And the reason we're still here is because of the fundraising from the local community. They want us here and we want to be here. But we are relying on thousands and thousands of pounds each year to be raised. And we recently have set up a GoFundMe page because of being closed during COVID. Now, why we were closed during COVID, it seems absolutely crazy, but we were actually better off. Because we are so, currently, 87% of our income is through government funding and 13% of our income is through fees for our unfunded 2-year-olds. So we could furlough up to 13%, and the scouts who we rent the hall from, they didn't charge us any income, any rent. So while we were closed, we had no rent to pay and we had no resources to buy, and also we have to pay our staff overtime outside of normal hours in order for them to be able to complete their workload. And so we actually were better off staying closed, which sounds crazy. We don't want to do that. In September, we're going to have the concern that although the bubble has now been removed from the current guidance, it is still stipulating that wherever possible, to keep children to attend only one early years provider. That will cause us a lot of problems. Where we are community preschool, what we find happen is we have a lot of children here part-time whose parents work outside of the local area, who put their children in a full-time nursery nearer work. So they do mix this care. However, so we're now in a dilemma. If we carry on allowing children to come from 2 settings, we will be increasing the possible transmission with COVID. So we want to stick to the guidelines and we want to keep it down, but we will lose children, which obviously will lose income and will put ourselves even in a hard position. So, the COVID situation, from our perspective, is hard with regards to the other settings. Going back to staffing, recently, again, past 3-4 years, what's evolved is that there's now a lot more pressure on us. We have to pay pensions, which we never had to do before. The funding rate didn't increase in line with minimum wage increases. Minimum wage, national living wage, has increased. In past years, it's gone up significantly. And so what we've now found is that our staff, in order to pay them the minimum wage, each year we're having to increase our staffing expenditure, which is on top of pensions and the minimum wage. However, we want our staff to earn more than the minimum wage. Currently, we obviously want them to be qualified and we want them to be trained. We're giving them, and we have no benefits for them financially. We can't give them sickness pay, we can't give them any form of holiday pay, other than the basic minimum entitlement for holiday pay. They could go and work in a supermarket and they would earn significantly more per hour than they do here, with no qualifications and no expectation of them to be working outside their actual hours. So as a consequence, recruiting staff and keeping staff is incredibly hard. So the way funding is operating and early years is being funded at the moment is just not viable. There has to be a huge shake-up. Like I say, one size doesn't fit all. As a semi-rural setting, parents attracting people to us outside the local community, attracting staff to work in our setting where they have to drive perhaps much further. We need to have incentives. We can't even cope on the basic minimum funding. With regards to 30 hours that came in, again, several years ago, what actually that has done is stopped us being able to charge top-ups, because the children that go over their 15 hours are now currently funded for those 15 hours. While we charge more for our unfunded children, that helps. Very few children come to us until just before their 3rd birthday, so that's 13% of our income. That's a very small income. The government stipulate that funding is free, so that other than the consumables, which for a small amount of snack, we can charge top-ups for, we have no other means of charging top-ups to our parents. And it's those top-ups to the parents that allow earlier settings to be viable. That's how nurseries make their money, is the hours outside the funded hours and for the much younger children. As a local community preschool that is predominantly funded by the local government, we are not viable. Our scouts have recently, 2 years ago, cut our rent in half. We pay our scouts a phenomenally small fee, which is wonderful. They've been very supportive. However, the premises has fallen apart and the scouts now do not have the money to correct the premises because they're not getting the income from us. So it is a huge vicious circle that we feel needs to be addressed. With regards to COVID, we've had to pay a lot more cleaning materials. Schools have had a budget given to them to provide them for cleaning or additional hours that they need in order to do this cleaning. Early years sectors have had nothing. There's no support with PPE, there's no support with cleaning materials, and these requirements are still going to continue into September. So while we were okay because we were closed, opening up is actually, because of COVID, is actually going to become an additional issue with regards to our finance. So that's really where we're coming from, and that's pretty much my bit over.
Thank you very much, Mandy. We move straight to Joanne Mahar from Kingsworthy Preschool. She's on the line. She'll have 10 minutes to speak as our second deputy.
Hey, thank you. Kingsworthy Preschool is a charity run at the heart of Kingsworthy, employing 7 members of staff and normally looking after 49 children between 8:30 and 3:30 in term time. As an organisation with a vision to be the preschool of choice of all children in the local community, we walk a tightrope between a fee structure which is viable and being affordable for all. Early years funding has not kept pace with the rise of costs, most notably wages. And the 30 hours funding introduced in September 2017 has been great for working parents, but has been restrictive on settings to control their overall income generation from hourly fees. There are restrictions on what can be charged for, and we've sought not to restrict the use of universal and funded hours in order to keep our setting accessible to all. Charging for enrichment activities such as music and sports activities denies access for those of lower income families, and we have supported these activities from a mixture of grants, pupil premium and fees. They do not generate us any income. Another often suggested funding stream is registration fees and deposits, usually returned with the final invoice and often as much as £250. But these are barriers for low-income families accessing childcare. Few grants fund existing projects, cover staffing or core costs for preschools, as these are regarded as being covered by the statutory EY funding. Hampshire County Council's rent for all preschools is fixed at 7% of income, based on, in our case, on a fixed year in a 5-year cycle without room for negotiation. Because we share a site with the school and are in a managed building, we do not have control over our utility supplier, which is often a suggested first step when considering efficiency savings. Although adjusted slightly, the funding rate dates back to 2012-13 costs, as well as the practitioner looking after the children, and this is restricted by ratio. There's also the requirement for planning, assessment, administration, management and safeguarding. In our setting this year, the team have dealt with 7 safeguarding cases. The time taken up to investigate, report and meet with other agencies and support the family all comes from the EY funding of between £4.37 and £5.20 an hour, while also paying for basic resources such as pens, paper, paint and the staff who are looking after the child at the centre of the case. Every safeguarding scenario stretches our already tight budget. Since the closure in 2017 of the Rain and Shine Children's Centre, which shared an entrance with the preschool, setting staff have been the frontline support for many families. A lot of support has gone online, and there are some great apps, but an app can't look you in the eye, see the kind of morning you've had, offer you a cup of tea and a listening ear. This kind of informal, early support and intervention is a lifeline for many who are struggling. As an organisation, we support and encourage our staff in their professional development. As a sector which is notoriously low paid, we have managed to value our staff and buck the trend of diminishing qualifications. 100% of our staff are training at level 3 or above, and nearly 50% have worked with us for over 5 years. Therefore, we did not enter the COVID crisis in a buoyant financial position. Our vulnerable and key worker families chose not to take up the places offered, and we closed the setting and supported all families and children at home with home learning packs, online support and regular phone calls. The trustees budgeted, agreed to pay staff and top up with 100%, a statement of our value of them. Then came the clarification announcement that the early years sector would not receive the 80% furlough funding. In our case, the amount received was 26% based on the figures for the spring term. However, the summer term traditionally sees an increase in fee-paying hours, and we would expect positive income from fees to be greater. In order to reopen and offer some childcare to as many children as possible, we have operated at a loss, with increased costs of professional cleaning, deep cleaning and regular cleaning of toys and resources, paired with not being able to have the space to generate fees. Our loss of fees equates to over a month's salary. We operate 2 bubbles with a total of 17 children attending. These include vulnerable children with EHCPs, behavioural issues, speech and language needs. To support them, it is necessary to have above ratio levels of staff in place. The summer term would usually be productive for fundraising and marketing, and we have received a sustainability grant. However, with tight operations and cash flows, it has been uncertain whether we will open in September. It is a time of great stress for staff, parents and trustees alike. This uncertainty, alongside lost marketing opportunities such as open days and fundraising events, means that we have low numbers for September. While we will be able to operate and open to capacity, some parents are reluctant to send their children to childcare settings, and the expected downturn in the economy means that we may see a drop in fee paying and 30-hour places. There are so many unknowns which cause stress and job insecurity. Our staff well-being is a serious concern, and some highly experienced practitioners are thinking of leaving the profession. COVID has brought additional needs and used up reserves, but most of all, it has highlighted the flaws in the current funding system. As pointed out in the Sutton Trust's Getting the Balance Right report 2020, there was a change in emphasis in 2017 from a focus on improving child's development to facilitating parental employment. This shift affected vulnerable children and those on the lowest incomes the most. Many of these families do not have access to their own transport, and being local, sharing our site with the primary school, helps them have routine and accessibility. This year, in our setting, we have one child with behavioural issues who requires one-to-one attention, one child with an EHCP plan who has physio sessions 4 times a week on a one-to-one basis, 6 children registered with speech and language therapy, and 2 children with English as an additional language. These all require small group or one-to-one sessions either daily or weekly. The setting manager and SENCO attend additional transition meetings for these children to ensure a smooth handover to school and that the appropriate provision can be in place. Funding for the physio sessions has to be applied for each year. Staff spend time writing applications, and which, even if they are successful, often aren't implemented until the child has left our setting and has started school. But if we didn't do this, the process would be significantly delayed. As trustees, we view it as an investment into the child's future, and again, it is a balance between ethos and budget. Currently, we have an inclusion fund application in process, but this has been delayed by the COVID situation. Every application costs staff time, but has the potential to significantly improve the child's development and well-being. Speech and language therapy and English as an additional language interventions for 8 children this year have been funded through the standard setting budget. We don't know what the needs of the children returning in September will be, or those who will be new to us. Many won't have attended any kind of formal childcare for 6 months, as well as the population as a whole their experience of lockdown will have been varied. The ability to access additional support funding quickly for vulnerable children will be essential, which is why we have already applied to the National Lottery Community Fund for a grant to support our family and wellbeing strategy in the autumn term, providing early intervention as soon as it is needed and identified. We're waiting for the outcome for this application.
Apologies for interrupting. Just to let you know, you have 1 minute remaining.
For us, having the flexibility to negotiate our net rent and fixed costs would make a significant difference moving forward. In the last few months, my fellow colleagues and I have faced and continue to face the possibility of the setting closing. We don't know what the children or their families needs they'll have, but we know those needs will be there. We know that there will be parents who need support with difficult children. We know that there will be development, social and emotional needs. And sadly, we know there will be safeguarding cases. We know that if we weren't there at the heart of our community to help the most vulnerable risk slipping through the net, we know that for many of those families, we are the front line for their support and we want to be there for their future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I understand you'll be leaving the meeting, but you're welcome to listen to the broadcast via the YouTube link which you have been provided. So we will move on to item 5, which is Chairman's announcements. I would just like to record my thanks to Councillor Marge Harvey for her contribution to the committee and congratulate her on her role as Vice Chairman of the County Council. And with that, we welcome Councillor Bill Withers to his first meeting of the committee. And I'll just take this opportunity to remind members on the new method of voting. It will save us time, so hopefully we will get on with the poll in the chat when the recommendations require our vote. Any member who is unable to use the poll can vote in the chat facility or verbally, as we've discussed with you, Councillor Edgar. If we have particular problems, then we can revert to a roll call that just will take more time. So with no further time spared, we'll move to item 6, which is Childcare Sufficiency Assessment, COVID-19 Impact and Response for the Childcare Sector.
Okay, good morning, members. This item is, there's going to be quite a lot of crossover with actually the 2 deputations that you've heard. The purpose is to give an update to the Select Committee on this area. Suzanne Smith's going to take us through that, and she's going to walk you through the paper. And I believe Suzanne's got a presentation which she will project for you in a second. So I'll hand over to Suzanne.
Thank you, members. Hopefully you can all see me. Bear with me while I get the presentation up onto your screens. Trust that you can all see that now.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you. So unfortunately, you all disappear when I do this, so I can't see your faces anymore. So I'm Suzanne Smith. I'm the Assistant Director in Children's Services with responsibility for early years sufficiency. So I've produced some slides to take you through the detailed report that was in your pack. The purpose of the report is twofold. Firstly, it is to update members on our sufficiency assessment. You'll be aware that we have a statutory duty to ensure that there are sufficient childcare places in Hampshire, and it's important that we cite members on that sufficiency assessment and our priority actions that we've identified by doing that assessment. That agenda item has been on the forward plan for some time, but obviously we've had the COVID pandemic in the meantime, and so we thought it sensible to kind of merge the two in, because there has been, as you would expect, some delay in some of the priority actions progressing due to the fact that we've been diverted through COVID. So we'll take you through both of those items within these slides. So I just wanted to start by giving you a bit of an overview of the Hampshire County Council context, and this is the pre-COVID context. So we've got around 1,400 childcare providers receive early years entitlement funding through the council, and another 400 or so on top of that who don't receive any funding and are primarily childminders. We've got 1,100 or so childminders, and then a variety of other types of settings. And I'd echo what one of the deputies said around, it's quite a diverse marketplace. There are lots of different types of provision, lots of different types of settings, and it does make it quite challenging to provide support, and we'll come into that later when we talk about COVID. In ordinary times, we have around just under 25,000 children accessing the funded 15 hours childcare, and 12,000 or so accessing the extended entitlement. Some of the other things to be aware of: we have a statutory duty to support after school care or wraparound care, so that's holiday clubs, breakfast clubs, after school clubs. And families can use their tax-free childcare to support the costs of that. So that's a bit about what Hampshire looks like. In terms of our sector, one of the really important things that I want to share with you is around how the childcare sector in Hampshire sustains itself. So there's some feeling from some parts of the country that the early years entitlement funding is the primary source of income for most childcare providers, but as you'll see from this slide, actually there are very few providers whose primary source of income is that early years entitlement funding. For a great many, they receive most of their funding through private parental fees. And again, as we come into the impact of COVID, you will immediately understand that's had quite a significant impact on the sector, where those private fees haven't been received by those settings. Echoing what the deputies have already said, there's been concern for some time that the early years entitlement funding perhaps isn't enough to sustain the sector. And although changes were made in 2017 to allow for some additional consumable charges, you've heard from people this morning around some of the costs that they incur and what they can and can't charge for. So just want to move on now, and I'll hand over to Tracy, who is our service manager for this area, and she's going to give you a bit of an update on the priority actions that we identified in our sufficiency assessment and how we're getting on with those. So over to you, Tracy. Yeah, Tracy.
I think she's might be muted, Suzanne.
Myself, sorry, apologies. Good morning. I'm Tracy Messer. I'm the service manager for Childcare and Business Support, and have a responsibility to make sure that the childcare sufficiency is enacted, and also look after the early years education funding and have a small team that provides support to the sector. And you will find in your report pack, the action plan that I'm referring to is on pages 16 to 18. And generally, we've seen in the childcare sufficiency that there is a market, a diverse market, as Suzanne says, that supports both the supply and demand for childcare. And it's done it well for a number of years, especially in the early years education front. There were some elements that we outlined in our sufficiency assessment that we wanted to do a little bit more of a sort of a deep dive, a delve into, and these were put into our action plan. And we have seen sort of for our younger age range that we do an annual census for the DfE, and we ask at that time for the sector to tell us all of the age ranges of children that they are accommodating. So this is our window into what it looks like for the children who aren't getting funding from the government. And what we had seen in both the 2018 and 19 was that there was a 1% growth in the number of children who were under 2 accessing some provision. So in 2018 it was 17% of them getting some provision, and in 19 there was 18%. So it started us to think that there were more children of younger years actually starting to take up provision. We had also seen in the population that the 3 and 4 year olds started to have some small decline over the next few years. And so we wanted to review the younger age to see whether that was something that the sector needed to step up to provide. We've collected the information, but the COVID-19 has actually delayed our analysis of that, but we're starting to review that as we go forward. Also, the CSA has shown us some preliminary data about the children who are receiving 30 hours childcare. We see generically around 12,000. That's a growth. I mean, we started off in the 2017 with about 7,000 to 8,000. There has been a considerable growth in the number of children who are accessing that funded entitlement. What we also wanted to look at is how many of those children who go into school actually currently purchase more hours than a school week. And our initial data show us there were some, and again we've tried to do that this year, and we've had some delays through getting the data organised and also sort of the capacity for the team to review that, but we're starting to move forward on that, and we can see that there are a number of children who will move into school for September, possibly needing some further out of school or childcare, and we want to get that information to the schools and the sector so that they're aware of that demand. We've also, in our childcare sufficiency assessment, mentioned about the rural sector. And so, like the presentations that we heard from Shawford and Compton, it's basically, we are seeing that some of those more traditional settings who are supporting smaller communities are struggling to meet the demands that are currently set upon them. So we wanted to review this further and actually look at what does that actually mean for that part of the sector. The project was starting in January, but because of the COVID has actually been put on hold, but will be reignited soon. Housing developments, there's a lot of housing developments within the county, and again we wanted to ensure that there was significant supportive childcare arrangements in any of the new buildings work that was carried out. And so together with the Children's Services Strategic Planning team who look at schools, we're a united front to ensure that we actually have sufficient childcare moving forward for those developments, and that piece of desktop work continues. Provider sustainability, as we've heard, both with Kingsworthy and Compton and Shawford, is something that is of concern and has been on the radar for a significant length of time. Because nationally, as we've heard, is that the early years education funding and the rules around it are quite restrictive. There is also the ability for childcare users to pay for additional hours, and as we saw in the slide that Suzanne put up, many of our sector do that, and you also, the parents can access tax-free childcare, so actually the funding paid to the setting can also be supported by an additional 20% of funding from the government, so the parents actually can receive that, and hopefully that gets put through to the setting to help pay for those fees. But population changes are do affect what's needed in a locality, as well as the type of parents in terms of whether they're employed or unemployed or vulnerable, as we've heard today as well. Around how the sector will respond to those needs. Generally, we've seen with our 2-year-old funding that we are usually around a couple of percent higher than national. National previously was about 69% of 2-year-olds, those who are eligible accessing the funded entitlement, and generally in Hampshire we've been around the 70 to 72%. We did, however, notice some areas in our assessment which were looking lower than our Hampshire trend, such as Rushmore, Fareham and Tess Valley. So we started to, in the last year, to directly market and contact the parents who had come in and confirmed their eligibility but had not yet taken up their place. That had been that was positive, and we saw 70% of those who were contacted by that method take up a place. Because of the change in the COVID-19 and the restrictions of providers actually providing places, the letter for summer wasn't sent out due to COVID, but we will be reigniting that process for the autumn term. The market has over the years moved extremely well in providing the flexibility. Again, as we've heard, it's to support primarily people returning to work. So there's been a shift in the amount of provision that is available for across the year and across the day, where we have seen a number of providers manage to open for longer hours. Excuse me. There is also, from that, sort of a concern within the marketplace. Again, the people who were speaking earlier have started to identify that some parents actually are reluctant now to start to think about whether they should or shouldn't return their children to childcare. Also, with more families now working from home, there is also a consideration that some families may change the type of childcare that they need in the immediate future, and possibly for the longer term if employers consider that they too wish to maximise on the working from home. We also heard in the deputations about the concern about the workforce, and this is cited in the Childcare Sufficiency assessment as well. What we have been doing is looking at a sector academy. I've been working with Basingstoke College and that actually helped to provide about 9 or 10 people actually into work through having some, so they were unemployed people and they were actually able to find jobs. That programme was actually to run out and roll out further to other colleges this year from the spring term, but it's actually was affected by the COVID-19 arrangements. Also, very much we promote childcare as a career within the job fairs. So we team up with the Job Centre Plus and other Hampshire County Council job fairs and career structures to actually partner and promote. And again, those sessions have actually been limited with the COVID-19. So we have this team of 5 development officers and we do support the sector and primarily over the period from sort of March through to now, it has been supporting the COVID-19 response and picking up the areas of sustainability and issues that may be forthcoming for running some of our COVID-19 funds. We are very much returning to looking at our capacity forward from the end of term this year to actually move forward with those actions and to prioritise things for the autumn term, which look very much around sustainability and business support. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you, Suzanne. So the impact really can be seen in these, in the first table on the left. So as Suzanne was saying, you know, if we look at our spring census, actually in the region of 34,000 children access some form of provision across 1,800 childcare providers. And on the March the 20th, all childcare provision was asked by the government to cease trading as it was currently doing and remain open only for key workers and vulnerable children. So the providers actually dropped to around 600 overnight, remaining open, and the first call for information gave us around 300 children, so that was less than 1% of the children actually in provision on the first week of lockdown, 30th of March. Over the period, you can see that we've actually moved forward. You know, May and June both saw rises in the number of children, and around the 16th of June there was 4,500 in provision. That has grown since, and I think it's closer to sort of 7,000 or 8,000 children. And one of the reasons that that restriction is there is because the COVID-19 guidance for the sector asked them to reduce how they offered their provision and was for infection control procedures, needing them to offer their provision in bubbles and bubbles of no more than 8. So it reduced the capacity of the settings overnight in terms of how they could operate.
I'm having some technical issues with my screen. Is it affecting your screen?
We've lost the presentation, Suzanne.
Right. Unfortunately, I don't have any controls at the moment to be able to change anything. Bear with me.
It's just that for the time being, Tracy continues with a verbal update, Tracy, and I just need to encourage you to move through it fairly quickly because I know members have got a number of questions stacking up.
Okay, thank you. So we have this very reduced facility over the COVID-19 response, and the inability of the sector to actually recover their parental fees. The government asked providers to be reasonable about their approaches to parental fees. We can see in the table to the right, which was for the position at the 29th of June, that from our early years education approved providers, that the majority of them have now returned to actually operating, which is a great testament to the resolve of that childcare market to actually work with us to open, and also because there was greater demand being placed upon them from parents. With the opening of the economy, for the childcare, for people to return to work, they needed the childcare. So we are starting to see the market return, and on the 2nd of July there was some further guidance announced that from the 20th of July the sector will no longer need to have that limitation of bubbles, but needed to be respectful still to infection control procedures and minimising that contact. Parents have been advised where possible to only use one provider, and as we heard in the Compton and Shawford, that is something which may actually affect some of the sector places moving forward. Hampshire has a history of parents choosing provision that meets their needs, and often that might be two providers, which will balance what their arrangements are. Could I have the next slide, please? If it's possible. We're going to move into the out of school sector actually, and what we have found in the out of school sector is this particular part has not been able to open at all unless they were on a school premise or were part of an early years provision, which was not the case for many of our providers. Also, our school sector were themselves operating in a lot of their buildings and had already set up their provision for key worker vulnerable, and there was very little space for third-party providers. So from the 20th of March, this particular sector became extremely dormant and has not been able to reopen until more recently. So we have a limited opening for out of school on school premises from the 1st of June, and a wider opening to support school holidays, and also starting to look forward to September. We know that there were we've started to engage with this sector because the sector generally doesn't come forward for support. So we have actually outreach to the out of school sector over the past weeks and brought them into various webinar arrangements so that we could hear what their concerns were, and we have passed those up to the DfE. The original concerns were the fact of the ability to keep the bubble. So the government guidance was asking for the out of school sector to maintain the children's bubbles that they were coming from their school, and that was very restrictive in terms of what they were looking at. There is still some ambiguity in the guidance, but the sector is now sort of looking at that to see how they can respond. Some of the out of school sector also used the furlough scheme, and so is now considering how and when it can return its staff to work. So we were looking really very closely at that sector to open for the summer where they can, and we're collecting data right here and right now to try and ensure that the Family Information Service is able to hold that. This is an area of growing work, as I mentioned, in terms of the needs of families to have out of school and childcare before and after, and holiday provision of those who are working. It could actually, in terms of if there is any economic downturn in terms of the wider economy and people are no longer employed, then there is that balance to be made on what childcare needs of parents will be in the future. Next slide, I think is yours, Suzanne. Thank you for listening.
Your microphone's off, Suzanne. Thank you, Tracy.
Suzanne, your mic is off.
Okay, I think Suzanne's having a technology problem. So she's gonna take over my place, and we're gonna socially distance and all that sort of stuff.
Apologies, I've lost all of my controls. So I'll just very quickly talk you through the support that we've offered to the sector during the pandemic. So as you can imagine, there's been a huge amount of work. We have digested the government guidance that has been issued daily, and we've tried to translate that for the sector, and we've issued that out via social media and through emails on a weekly basis. We've provided webinars, we've provided one-to-one support. We spun up a brokerage function using Tracy's team to ensure that no families who needed childcare during lockdown went without childcare. We've done a lot around financial support. So where we can, we have issued advanced payment of our early years entitlement funding, and we've also got a system set up for exceptional sustainability payments for those providers who are really, really struggling. And as you can imagine, we've done lots and lots of work through Steve and his links into the Association of Directors of Children's Services, through MPs and through the DFE to try and articulate and advocate for the sector. Just moving us on, the issues for the sector are, as you've heard, really, the loss of that parental income over the summer period, the loss of the private parental income, the capacity restrictions that mean that they cannot generate as much income as they normally would, and their concerns over the extent to which the entitlement funding covers their costs are all causing significant concerns for the future. And obviously the uncertainty that we're working in makes it really difficult for settings to plan for the medium and longer term. And there's a lot of detail on that in the report, so I won't go through it here and now. So just to kind of bring us to a conclusion, during lockdown, we provided childcare for all those children who needed it. So no children went without, and at the moment provision is keeping pace with demand. We continue to support the sector, and we're progressing with our sufficiency assessment wherever possible. But we know that that will be challenging and will require lots more effort and focus over the coming months and years. We're going to have to try and look ahead as best we can to help the sector to adapt and move forward. And we're imagining that that sufficiency obligation on us is going to be very challenging over the coming months. So I'll conclude there and be happy to take any questions that you may have. And it looks in the meantime like Steve might have fixed my technical problems.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you, Steve, for your wonderful dance, which we caught on camera, which was fantastic. I know members have already raised their hands, so we've got a number of questions coming in. So if I can just move straight over to our Vice Chairman, Councillor Ray Bolton, please.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank the two deputies, Mandy and Joanne. The picture they painted of funding is very worrying. So my question to both either Suzanne or Tracy is that, and it's picking up on the bullet point that Tracy presented about support to the sector, and that is engagement with central government, the DFE. So do you think that the Hampshire County Council, through Children's Services, should lobby further for increased funding for the childcare sufficiency? Thank you. If the answer is yes, I would like to turn that into an additional recommendation, Chairman.
Do you want me to come back in on that, Chair?
Please, yes.
Yeah.
We'll go to Steve first. Thank you.
It's difficult to see a way through this without a different structural solution to the funding. Now, we all know that there's not loads more money in the system, but it does strike. I think from Tracy and Suzanne's presentation, you'll see that there might be better ways of organising that money to reach providers that would help the system. One of the interesting things that we're seeing in the professional press, quite a lot of commentary about how there is a threat to the sector in areas of high deprivation. But in actual fact, for us, it's almost the reverse, because as Suzanne and Tracy have set out, because providers are so reliant on private income, and when that private income dries up, that's a real problem for us. So I'm more than happy, should the Select Committee want to recommend that I write to the DfE. It'll only be, frankly, reinforcing some of the things I've already said to them, but I'm more than happy to take that on board in due course.
So, Chairman, could I register the further recommendation at this point?
Yes, go ahead, Ray.
Sorry, can we do amendments and additional ones at the end of the questions, please?
And corrected. We'll
Okay,
save you to the end, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
Okay.
Can we move to Councillor Gavin James then, please, for your question?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Councillor Bolton's pretty much stolen my thunder, coming to the same conclusion, because it seems that most of the funding is linked to spaces, and of course lots of parents aren't utilising those spaces because they're working from home. So it's a sustainability, particularly of those smaller centres in the rural locations. They just can't sustain themselves. So there needs to be a sort of payment for retaining the spaces, because when we get back to normal, there won't be any spaces left. But as it happens, if you're going to amendments at the end, I haven't really got a question now, because I think it's all been answered. I will scribble down what I was going to put as an amendment into the chat, and I'm sure by the end of it we'll have probably something we can all agree on. Thank you.
I just lost you at the end, but that may be my connection rather than yours, but thank you very much. In that case, we will move to Councillor Malcolm Wade for a question, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I think the situation, I think you've identified actually in a way that many of these preschools have really fragile business models, and I think you've actually identified that. And my question really was going to be along the lines of what Councillor James and Councillor Bolton said. What more can we do to try and help them? And I'm happy to second an amendment to that effect, because I spoke to the officers early on in this process about a preschool in the New Forest, which was really on the verge of going bankrupt, even at that stage, when they weren't going to get the furlough money because of their balance between private and public sector children. So, you know, and I'm sure they're not unique. And we really need to find a way to protect this provision to help both the development of the children and to help the very many parents who need it, Chairman. It's not really a question now, is it? Sorry.
Not really a question, but that's okay. We'll move swiftly to Councillor Michael Westbrook. Hopefully we'll get a question in soon.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've got three brief questions, which might not be brief answers. On page 21 of our report, it shows the number of emails received from providers and families in a graph. And I'm just wondering, there was a lot of peaks in there, and I wonder those main peaks, reasons for those peaks, tie in with government's announcements, obviously, you know, concerns for people and changes. My second question is in bullet point 39, also on page 21, in reference to double funding for different providers. Will it be highlighted in our monthly returns made to government, and will the government be covering the cost of this? And my last shortish question is, the report says that there's an increase, this is on page 23.51. The report says that there's an increased likelihood of groups run by parents volunteers closing, and there are 192 of these settings in Hampshire. Are they spread across the county, or will some areas be more affected than others should they close? In addition, with the announcement by Gavin Williamson last week that the limit on group sizes will be removed from the 20th of July, make a difference to these groups' survival, or do you believe it will still revolve around parental choice? Thank you, Chair.
I'm happy to pick those up. So in response to your first question about contact, there absolutely was a link between government guidance and peaks in contact. So as you would imagine, we had quite a, one of the deputies talked about the confusion around furlough for early years providers. We had a real peak of communication and questions around furlough and you know what was and wasn't permissible We've also had peaks at each time year groups have gone back. As you'd expect, more families contacting us with any issues that they need our support with to secure childcare. In terms of your second question about the double funding, that is a decision that we've made locally in Hampshire to support those, or not penalise those providers who were unable to open, whilst also ensuring that providers who took on new children weren't financially penalised either. We will be putting that forward to government as something that we would like them to cover the costs of. But at this stage, that's not confirmed. The government asked us to pay all early years entitlements right at the beginning of lockdown, and so we did that in full for the summer term, and then some guidance changed several weeks later to suggest that we could adjust early years entitlements. Now, the only way we could have done that in Hampshire would have been to recoup money from providers to redistribute it, and that didn't feel to us to be the right thing to do. So we await a kind of government position on that one, and obviously we monitor the costs very closely. In response to your point around the community settings, our concern for those settings is that they are they're largely voluntary, and you know, if I think about kind of myself in that setting and volunteering to be on a preschool committee, I don't think many people envisage that they would be doing kind of risk assessments and infection control procedures when they thought they were helping a setting out, and that's the reason that we're particularly concerned about those types of settings. What we will be able to do is build on the work that Tracy has already started by kind of facilitating contact within the sector. So what we've been trying to do is use providers, for example, who've kept going all the way through lockdown to share knowledge and expertise and help build confidence in other bits of the sector. So we will do some targeted work around that, but we can also make sure that we make the guidance as easy to navigate as possible for those types of settings. I would hope that the hardest bit for some of those settings has been around the initial welcoming back of children. And so I would hope that we've gotten over the kind of most frightening bit for some of those settings, but we will continue to monitor very closely.
Thank you, Suzanne. Can we go to Councillor Jackie Porter before we go to second questions, please?
Thank you. And in view of my interest, I'm just going to try and keep this to a general point, actually, that 2-year-olds are funded around £5 an hour. 3-year-olds are funded at £4 an hour. And that looks originally like it's a problem, but for people that aren't in the sector, they won't understand that 4 5-year-olds is the maximum you can have. So one adult can only generate an income of vulnerable children of just over £20 an hour, whereas an adult can generate an income of £32 an hour for vulnerable children that are 3. And that failure of the government to recognise the need to support both age groups of vulnerable children is a challenge for any setting, whether they be for vulnerable children or for other children as well, but particularly for those with vulnerable children. And the council will know that I contacted the council because we had childminders who had children that weren't vulnerable, whose livelihoods just stopped completely, and they went to work in Tesco's. So, and they won't go back. So I think we're underestimating the effect on childminders, and we're underestimating the effect on 2-year-old provision. I think those are 2 particular areas where we need to be looking at the provision for those sectors. I just wondered if the officer has any comment about, particularly about 2-year-olds.
We can hear you, Steve.
Yeah, I can see what's going on. I don't necessarily disagree, actually, and I think the issue for us is how we structure that within the budgets that we've got, and how we can help childminders in the current context and going forward. I don't know if other of my colleagues want to pick up on the points.
I would say that looking at last week's, we have to return data to the DfE weekly around how the sector is opening and the children attending, and the numbers of childminders now open is up to kind of about 3/4 now. So actually, it's quite promising in terms of those who are back up and running.
Thank you. And what about the rate, the differential rates that you can actually earn as a setting if you're actually earning £4 now, £4 for 3-year-olds and £5 for 2-year-olds?
I haven't got a particular comment on that.
Suzanne, do you want me to just take that?
I'm just wondering, Jackie, could you clarify the question, please?
That at the moment, the way in which the funding works for vulnerable 2-year-olds, and it is vulnerable 2-year-olds that are funded, it actually generates less money per earned person. So actually, immediately, any setting that accepts vulnerable 2-year-olds is at a disadvantage to those that takes paying 2-year-olds.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, Tracy, do you want to come in on that?
The rates that are set, it's actually the government who sets the rate for the 2-year-olds, the funded 2-year-olds, and it's also recognises in the funded 2-year-olds that the ratio per child is less. And I think that's what Jackie is saying, is that when you have an adult to 4 children, obviously you can only make £20, whereas if you've got 1 to 8 and you're on, I think our highest rate is actually £4.55. For the 3 and 4-year-olds, you can actually attract more funding, but it is actually the government that we have no, our funding formula does not affect the 2-year-old funding. It's purely a government transfer of money. So it is, if there's any change to be made on that, that is actually again within possibly the government needs to make that change. And the 2-year-olds are recognised for being funding for vulnerability. That was how it was designed by the government, and there's always been a higher value to that compared to the 3 and 4-year-old funding. But I do take on board what Jackie is saying there, Councillor is saying there, but it's not ours to be able to change.
It's factually correct, and I think where that takes us is that's one of the things that we can reasonably be saying to government in a letter to go. Would say this is the sort of thing you need to look at, and in terms of what is a structural inequality.
Yeah, I think that's the point I'm making, really. That I appreciate it's not a Hampshire position, but a Hampshire choice, but it is actually, by definition, those young people are vulnerable. Those children are vulnerable and will need additional needs assessed. So, by definition, they should actually be costing any setting more money, but actually we're being paid less money.
Thank you, Jackie. Can I go to Councillor Fran Carpenter, please?
Thank you very much. Yes, I just wondered, Steve, what moves Hampshire County Council are making to work with and encourage parents to get their children back to preschools where they can, if obviously some parents aren't sending their children as usual. Can we work with can we try to put out messages to parents that it's really important, or they might lose their settings?
Yeah, I think generally when we well, perhaps what I might invite you to do is just to hold the thought for a minute, because we're going to do a presentation shortly about our response to COVID. And one of the things you'll see is a really positive response around our schools and indeed our early years settings, about getting children into those settings, because which is frankly far outstrip the national average and it is at the very top of the scale. So and of course many parents have a child that might have a child in an early years setting, but then a child in an infant school, or perhaps or a primary school, and then perhaps a slightly older child. So I think it's gone hand in hand with the schools reopening, and I think we've done pretty well thus far using the prophecy around that. And I think we're still we continue to work at it. I think the other thing that is really important in this are other national messages around this, and we've fed back that we felt we needed a really clear message to come from government about what was going to happen in September, so that all settings, early years, schools, secondary, whatever, can start to plan, and parents can start to get their heads into the space of expectations that schools and settings will be open from the beginning of September, and that they can plan accordingly. And I think that message is now out there, and the feedback that we're getting is that that's edging people towards what, making plans for September.
Thank you, Steve. Can we move to Councillor Zilia Brooks, please?
Thank you. It's for Tracy. It's on page 25. It's 6.4. It's about schools may choose to deliver to 11-year-olds to reduce the demand for private. I just wondered, is it worth the schools and the private sector to work together so they could bring the private sector into the school and then work with the school and their budgets, and then that will help the child later on in life, that they be under the same roof, and so when they futurely join the school, that will be a good thing. Thank you.
I think I can probably pick that up one. I think what we're trying to think through the different medium and longer term things that might happen that could affect sufficiency, and we know that there are some schools that start at 2 already and go all the way through to 11, and we wondered if COVID might increase the number of schools doing that. We already have private sector working alongside schools in some places, and we facilitate that where it's necessary for us to fulfil our sufficiency duty. So we will continue to do that, where it makes sense to do so.
Thank you, Suzanne. Councillor Powell-Hare.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I was going to suggest that also if perhaps the school could take on the private sector, because they're obviously struggling a lot. Going forward, what further support is available for the struggling after school private sector to be able to keep them into business?
It's a tricky one, because obviously we don't have the financial resources that the sector potentially needs to keep itself going. What we will do is continue to work to make sure that the information is understood, the guidance is well understood, that we create those self-sustaining networks within the sector, that where we can, by things like advance paying the early years entitlement, we help these groups with their cash flow. Some of the work that Tracy and the team did under the sufficiency assessment was really value around identifying providers who we feel are to be particularly at risk, and we monitor those particularly closely and provide one-to-one support for those organisations as and when they need it. So we'll continue to do that. I think as it's been discussed, some of the issues around the financial sustainability are government issues that we will need to collectively look for ways to address.
The other thing, if I got your question right, Councillor Hare, was that it was also about after school facilities as well, and I think the recent shift in the guidance, I mean, one of the things that we were getting quite a lot of email traffic around was the notion that you had to have, you could only have 4 children with 2 adults, and I think some of the providers couldn't see a way forward on that, and that guidance, as I understand it, is shifting or has shifted, and that will free up their capacity, I think, over the summer. So, and that only came out the other day, but that has been well received, I think.
Thanks. Okay, I did have Councillor Bill Withers on my list, but I think you've lowered your hand. So just to confirm if you had a question, and if anyone else has a question, if you want to unmute and just ask a question. Otherwise, I can move to second questions if anyone has any. And if not, we will go back to Ray to discuss his additional recommendation. So no one's shouting, so I think we'll go back to Councillor Ray Bolton, please. Just need to unmute, Ray.
Hear me now?
Oh, we can indeed.
Yeah, sorry. I was typing in the additional recommendation in the chat box there. Whether you have you got it?
I have got it. Would you like to read it out for us, Ray?
Okay, obviously I haven't got the chat text in front of me, but it's basically that the additional recommendation from this select committee is that the Children and Young People Select Committee asks the executive member for Children's Services to write to the Secretary of State for Education, highlighting the particular difficulties in the childcare sector in Hampshire and lobby for more help for the sector.
Thank you, Ray. Katie, you had your hand up.
Do I have a second?
I'm happy to second
for that.
I can see lots of visual hands, but Councillor Jackie Branson was the first verbal.
Thank you.
So I will take you as the seconder. And I believe we will have a poll in the chat on this additional recommendation.
Hello, good morning. Hi, Chairman. Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, as Councillor James's proposal was quite similar to Councillor Bolton's, I have kind of amalgamated the two. If you wanted to do that and have like one combined recommendation rather than two separate similar ones.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. What I will do is I will put that in the chat and then I will read it out for those that might not be able to see it. So I've got the Select Committee asks the Exec Member for Education and Skills and Exec Lead Member for Children's Services and Young People to write to the Secretary of State highlighting the particular difficulties in the childcare sector in Hampshire and to try and establish a scheme that will provide payments to support the viability of childcare providers to retain spaces during the pandemic and recovery period. Councillor Bolton, would you be happy to amalgamate the two, or would you rather stick with just your original recommendation?
No, I'm happy to amalgamate the two in the way that you have done, Katie.
Okay, thank you.
Did you hear that?
Yes, thank you. So if you're happy, Chairman, I will do a poll just to agree that additional amalgamated recommendation.
Yeah, Councillor James, are you happy with that approach?
Yep, very sensible. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch a proposed and a seconder for that. Is Jackie? I might have missed it, so apologies.
Councillor Ray Bolton has proposed that, and Councillor Jackie Branson was first to second the recommendation. So
yeah.
we will.
Lovely for the amalgamated one.
Yes, thank you.
Happy to second the amalgamated one.
Oh, actually, because it's an amalgamated one, would it be more sort of mindful for Gavin to second it as it's an amalgamation of the two? Apologies, Councillor Branson.
Yeah, more than happy to second it. Gives it extra strength if it's cross-party, I think.
Thank you, Gavin.
Yes, thank you, Gavin.
Thank you.
Okay, that has just appeared in the chat now for that additional recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So if members could go to their the meeting chat function, and you will see item 6 additional recommendation is in there. You will have 3 options: for, against and abstain. Please remember to press submit vote once you've selected. And for anyone who is not using the poll, if you could either write whether you are for, against or abstain in the chat, or confirm it verbally, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. We have a majority in favour of the extra recommendation.
Thank you. Can I just double check if everyone's had time to indicate their preference in the chat? I know the co-opted members weren't able to use the poll, so if they're able to write in the chat facility, they can.
Yeah.
Just to say I'm support.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Super, thank you. I can see they've come into the chat now, so we will accept the additional recommendation. Thank you very much. So we will move to the recommendation as set out in the paper. So that's that the Children and Young People Select Committee note the contents of the Childcare Sufficiency Assessment 2019 and the associated action plan together with the updated position in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that the Children and Young People Select Committee note the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic upon the childcare sector and the County Council's support to the sector during this time. I understand we will have an additional poll being populated shortly.
Thank you. I'm just completing that now. Thank you. That is now in the chat for the original recommendations in the report.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, and I can confirm that's a majority in favour, so those recommendations are carried.
Great, thank you. Peter, did you wish to verbally record your response?
Yes, please. Thank you. I'm not clear on how I'd make that, but I've stated it.
No problem.
Is it okay? Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Great. I'm not sure everyone's responded, but we do have a majority. So if we're happy to move on, we will move to item 7, which is our update on the COVID-19 response. And I believe Steve will kick off from here.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's obviously an important item, and we thought the best way we could present this really was a presentation, not least because we're adding up-to-date information to it all the time. What I'm going to do is invite our assistant directors to go through the presentation, which is in the pack, but to go through it at pace, so that you get plenty of time for questions and so forth. I'm going to project it on the screen. What could possibly go wrong? And my colleagues will tell me when to move on to the slides. So I'm going to ask Stuart to kick us off as soon as the slide appears with you, and I think it's just about to come up. There we go.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, Stuart.
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and good morning, members. It's nice to see you again. This presentation sets out how we've managed children's social care services during lockdown and the last 3 months. I will go through it at pace because I know it's in your pack and you will have had an opportunity to see it. So if we could move 2 slides, please. So at the beginning, just before lockdown, we were advised to plan for up to 60% of staff being off as a worst case scenario. So on that basis, we took a 3-phased approach to managing through the pandemic. Phase 1 was around having around 20% staff absent, phase 2, 40, and phase 3, worst case scenario. We identified our key priority services. They won't surprise you. They are our children's homes, Swanwick Lodge, our foster carers, because those children in those placements can't go anywhere else. So we have to keep those running whatever throughout all 3 phases. And indeed, the other 2 areas were out-of-hours services and our MASH, which is the front door to children's social care. What I'm really pleased to say is, whilst we had up to 22% of our staff self-isolating or unable to work at the peak, in general terms, we've never exceeded that. And we have maintained our position in phase 1 throughout. And what that means is we've kept all of our statutory services running, all of our statutory timescales for meetings, for visiting children, they've all remained in place. And I'll touch on those a little bit more. Next slide, please. So on the left there, you can see some of the actions we've taken fairly quickly and early on. We had to issue new guidance to social workers. They had to understand how they could undertake a virtual visit using technology. They wanted to have greater contact with their local managers, because understandably many of our staff are working from home and often on their own, and therefore they're needing the extra management support that they've required. On the right hand side are some of the more strategic things that we've undertaken. So I've had daily meetings with my senior managers, getting updates on individual cases and individual districts and how services were responding. It was variable across the county, of course. We had sickness in some parts of Hampshire, while other parts were healthy and in work. We've got a good audit trail around the decisions that we've made. We know that at some future point, Ofsted will come and inspect us, and they will want to understand why we've made some of the decisions that we've made. And we've got all of that clearly set out. We developed an FAQ, a frequently asked questions for social workers about PPE, about how you record a visit where you don't see a child, what happens if you have to go into a house because a child is at immediate risk. So a whole range of frequently asked questions have been developed. And then we've been meeting with the wider management team on a weekly basis, again, taking the temperature check across the service to make sure that we're delivering what we need to deliver. Next slide, please. And this is a bit of a story here. What you can see here in terms of data is the number of referrals coming into children's social care. You can see that in March 2019, around about 1,600 referrals. If you look at March 20, that was up. We know that referrals and demand goes up year on year. But by April of this year, it had dropped. It had dropped down to what we would think of as being half-term levels when the schools are closed, as indeed they were. And that didn't surprise us. We expected that. I think where we were less expecting things to go was in May, despite schools being open but only receiving vulnerable children, we were back to normal levels of demand. And in fact, through June, we've now seen a 15, almost 20% increase in demand above what we would expect. And there are some obvious reasons for that. Some families have not received services for a 3-month period from other agencies, and they've gone into crisis. We've had to take more emergency steps around families than we would normally, going in with the police to remove children where families have reached crisis point and not been able to cope. As we move out of lockdown, hopefully some of those services will go back in, not necessarily from children's social care, but from other agencies such as health, the schools, etc. And that will, of course, I hope, support those families and prevent them going into a crisis at an early point. But I would point out that we are expecting this spike in demand to be sustained. And if, as was mentioned earlier, there is an economic downturn, as we are advised there could well be, then unemployment, we know, is a key driver behind adult mental health, adult substance misuse and domestic abuse. And they are the key drivers for services, children coming into children's social care services. So we've got one eye on the future already in terms of demand levels. Next slide, please. So how have our social workers maintained the service? Well, they've been visiting children. If children have been at risk, we have gone into family homes. Staff have gone in with PPE. They've gone in with the police as well, if necessary, to remove those children and keep them safe. But in the main, around about 90% of our visits and our contact with children and families has been through the use of technology. So we've used WhatsApp is a really good example, and we've asked parents to show us around the house. We've been able to spend time alone with older children, talking to them and understanding how things are. We have also had to undertake assessments because we have still been making applications to court, albeit the court hearings have been virtual. So we have still all of the normal businesses that we do out of lockdown have continued uninterrupted. Next slide, please. Our children in care, clearly our most vulnerable cohort. I have to say our foster carers, our residential workers and our social workers have been outstanding in the way that they have responded to maintain those relationships with children, to offer foster carers more support, to make sure that placements are stable and that our vulnerable children, young people, we remain in contact with them and we know that they're safe and well. And there's some points there that we illustrate some of the things we've been doing to increase the resilience in the service. Next slide, please. Again, just to round out foster carers and residential, we've had foster carers who have received children from homes where there have been COVID, and yet they've welcomed them into their own home as part of their commitment to supporting our vulnerable children. Next slide, please. Partnership working has always been a strength in Hampshire, in my view, and it's only increased during this the last 3 months, particularly working hand in glove with police. We've shared information about those children and families who were at the highest risk, those who, if somebody was off sick, we would want to make sure somebody was going into the home. And that's worked really well. We've shared a great deal of information and, where necessary, gone out together to make sure that children were safe. But I would include health, public health, of course. All agencies have been really responsive and pulled together. Next slide, please. And something around our staff. The pictures on the right are a video that senior managers pulled together as a way of saying thank you to all of our staff who have continued to go above and beyond. They've adapted really quickly, but they've maintained a relentless focus on keeping children safe, and they deserve enormous credit to my mind. Next slide, please. This is about the connectivity of our staff. One of the social workers dealing with really tricky cases and with vulnerable children, we've been very mindful of their well-being. Many of them live on their own. Many of frontline practitioners are relatively young, so they may have shared accommodation. We've been very, very conscious of needing to stay in touch with them and supporting them as much as possible. And the feedback from them has been that that's been much appreciated. Next slide, please. I won't go through these, but I would encourage members to read them in the pack. It's direct feedback from young people and also some of our staff, just some quotes about actually how they have felt supported and how they've responded during the last 3 months. Next slide, please. And I'll pull out a couple of points here. So there's an awful lot that's worked incredibly well. One of the things that we've learned is for some of our teenagers and particularly our care leavers, they really enjoy the virtual contact with their social workers. They were really used to using WhatsApp and having video calls. It was us in many ways that had to adjust. And their feedback has been they like that and they want to keep some of that moving forward. And I'm absolutely certain we will. Also, some of the meetings that we have, people have been able to dial into the meetings. So we've had improved attendance. The police, for example, have been able to attend every child protection conference in Hampshire over the last 3 months. That's because they're not having to drive around the county going to different meetings. So again, there's some thinking there about we want to keep some of that. If it works for agencies and it's better for children and families, then we don't want to lose it. On the right-hand side, just a couple of points there I would make. Some things that didn't work so well. Making sure people are equipped to do the role. It's good working at home for many people, but you do need to have the right IT and you need to have a comfy seat, as I'm sure you're all well aware. And then the bottom bullet point there around parenting assessments. Our social workers go into court and they have to be very confident that their assessment will stand up to the scrutiny of giving evidence and being cross-examined. And that's actually quite difficult when they may not have stepped inside a family's house to have that real professional certainty about the judgment that you're forming. So we need to think about, should we be in this position again? How do we support that? And I think I'm coming towards the end, but next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about what next. We think we are increasingly confident that we will see a sustained spike in demand. We're planning in terms of resource around that, how we can make sure we can respond to it. And we're looking at how we slowly transition staff back into office space whilst not losing some of the benefits I've just referred to. Next slide, please. That's more of the same around new ways of working, making sure we don't lose those positives. And next slide again. So in conclusion, business as usual, we're doing it differently. We've maintained all of our services. Members should take great assurance from that children have continued to be seen and kept safe. We've had proper, solid management oversight. The staff and our foster carers and residential workers have been tremendous, and our work with agencies has continued. And there is just one last slide which I will touch upon before I pass the baton. Oh, no, it's gone. Okay, I want to make the point then that I think it's an important point. We are a children's services, and my branch has been working very, very closely with Brian's and Suzanne's. It's been a collective joint effort to achieve this for children's social care and to support vulnerable children getting back into schools. And at that point, I will be quiet. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Stuart. And with Chair's permission, I'll ask Brian to press on, and if it's okay, we'll do questions at the end. It probably makes more sense that way. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Brian, over to you.
Good morning, colleagues. Do you want to, are you doing the slides then, Steve? Next slide then, please. So what I've kind of got is the story of the last 3 months. So you'll recall this all started on a Thursday, where schools were told that they had to close on end of the day on Friday the 20th of March. But were then promptly told that they had to reopen on the Monday for the children of critical workers and vulnerable children. We had quite a lot of confusion right at the start around critical workers, definition of those, whether it was one parent or two. We extended the definition of vulnerable children in Hampshire. But basically, the DfE's definition was children open to social care, but it didn't include early help. So we included those children in our assessment as well as the other groups. Next slide, please. So one of the pieces of work we put in place almost immediately was I worked very closely with Stuart and colleagues in social care and head teachers to put in a system for trying to make sure we had a focus on getting the vulnerable children back into schools. So we sent every single school a list of all the children that were known to social care as early help, children in need, children on a child protection plan, and looked after children, and asked for a weekly return from each of those schools as we tried to get those children back in, and where they were not coming in for health reasons, to make sure that we got proper contact arrangements and eyes on those children. And great piece of partnership work between head teachers, social workers and colleagues from the school improvement team. We've had a much higher proportion of our vulnerable children in schools than anywhere else in the country. And I know the first few weeks I was having the DfE saying, could you explain to us how you've done that? Because we were well ahead of the rest of the country on that. So initial weeks, 260 kids in, that's 2,200 vulnerable children in now. With children on an EHCP, what we did with that is each school put in place a risk assessment, and it was basically trying to get as many students in as possible where it was as safe for the children to be in school or safer for the children to be in school. You'll be aware, because of some of the health conditions of children with an EHCP, in those early days, the last place we would have wanted them to be was in school. So it was done via individual risk assessment. And there's just over 20% of children with an EHCP in their schools now. Next slide, please. One of the key bits of work that schools have had to do is to adapt to ensure that children could get learning at home. And that's not something teachers are trained for. So they adapted rapidly, and obviously, you know, all schools have got autonomy about how they determine their approach to curriculum and pedagogy matters. But they've had to put in place home learning. And again, you'll recall right at the start of this, they were told this was childcare they were providing, but as the weeks have gone on, it's become more education focused. So all schools have put in place home learning. It has been variable, but then learning is variable in schools anyway, because schools have autonomy over this. But the principles they've tried to do is to put in place some first-hand experiential learning. We didn't want something where the children were spending all their time on the internet. We thought that too much FaceTime was probably not a good thing, and actually it would be good if they were doing some tasks outside in the garden, in the house, as well as online. Many schools have put in place a kind of daily blog, provided resource packs and daily emails, trying to get the learning in manageable chunks with a focus on quality rather than quantity. Try to recognise that parents aren't subject specialists to make the learning as family friendly as well. And they've tried to have an emphasis on enjoyment as well as learning. And there's been support for all schools from the DFE with the National Oak Academy doing lessons online that schools have been able to tap into. For primary schools, we've provided a weekly curriculum pack and advice on English and maths lessons. So if schools had used those, the children would have had access to a pretty decent curriculum. And just so you're aware, the DFE asked us to work on the commission for the BBC programme. So if you've enjoyed those, that's members of my team and Hampshire head teachers worked with the DFE to make sure that the BBC's lessons met a decent standard. Our school improvement team throughout has had at least weekly conversations with every single head teacher in terms of coaching them to look at attendance of vulnerable children, home learning. Some schools have needed daily conversations to keep them going. Governor services have provided support to governors. We've had now over 190 different bits of guidance out to schools based on the public health guidance, and we've tried to ensure that schools have understood that correctly. We've been producing frequently asked questions on a weekly basis, getting those out to schools. And we worked with head teachers to create 3 think pieces. We had 16 secondary heads, for example, work with us to devise the sort of questions that secondary leadership teams should ask themselves before reopening on the 15th of June. A similar document for primary, similar document for special schools. There has been throughout a huge focus on well-being and mental health, and I think schools have done that well. There's been good signposting to a whole raft of support that's been sent out to schools. In terms of the laptops, that's not been easy always. So the DFE produced a laptop scheme for those children open to social care that had not got a laptop, and those children that were from disadvantaged families in year 10. Social workers were asked to identify the children open to social care. They did that. Those laptops were ordered. They arrived, 33 pallets of them, and they all got out to schools and are being used. The DFE then ran out of laptops for the disadvantaged in year 10, but we have rescued that situation, and those laptops are being delivered to schools this week. We've also had an info cell which is set up, and we've had queries coming in from parents, from head teachers, staff, governors, and we've addressed the whole gambit of things from HR to media advice to public health and so on. Primary schools then reopening on the 1st of June, and at the time nobody had heard of a bubble. Now everybody talks the language of bubbles, and those are some of the priorities on that slide that schools had to address when working out how to reopen. Can I make it clear that the guidance was different to what ministers were saying on occasion? So ministers were saying all children of critical workers, vulnerable year 1, year R and year 6 will all be allowed back in. That was never the case, and that wasn't what the guidance said. The guidance said that firstly, schools should look at the children of critical workers and the vulnerable. If they'd still got space in bubbles, they should then target year 1. If they'd still got space, year R, if they'd still got space year 1, and then finally, if they'd still got space year 6. For some schools, and I'll quote Talavera Infant School, for example, they've got 260 children on roll. They've got 210 critical workers. So they haven't been able to bring back the other 3 year groups on top of that. They've had all their staff on critical workers. Next slide, please. You'll appreciate the circumstances for head teachers were particularly tricky around the 1st of June. They were dealing with staff that were very worried about coming back into school, some staff that couldn't wait to get back. There were some messages from professional associations warning staff about going back. There was the independent SAGE advice that came out a couple of days before, which I think was particularly challenging for some head teachers to assimilate. They had different guidance from DfE. Parents saying they didn't want their kids to come back, parents saying they did want their children to come back, and head teachers had to navigate their way through that. But at the end of that week, we've got over 25,000 students back in. And then on the 15th of June, secondary schools opened for year 10 students only, which was basically some face-to-face work supplemented by home learning with the proviso, public health advice, they couldn't have more than 25% of year 10 on site at any one time. And at the end of that week, we've then had 37,000 students returning. We've also provided support to secondary schools around the awarding of GCSE grades for the current year 11. You'll appreciate that every single head of department has had to work out, based upon the work that's been left in the schools, what grade children should have. So we've been providing some support and guidance around that for each of the secondary schools. In terms of our teams, rather like Stuart, business as usual, but doing things differently. The special educational needs team has been relentless on its focus of trying to ensure that children with an EHCP, those continue to get processed. We've secured over 98% now of year 6 EHCPs and places for them to go into year 7. The educational psychology team has still been providing advices for children that are special needs, and they've also been dealing with some awfully tragic, sad incidents, COVID related as well. We've had some suicides of adults actually where the children have been affected, and the Ed Sites team have been in there supporting that. You may well have seen some of the work of the music service. They've shifted online, they've done ensembles online, they've been providing lessons online as well. Specialist teaching advisors and the inclusion team and the virtual school team are again all shifted online and providing work to schools. The Careers Advisory Service have been doing an awful lot of work with year 11 students face-to-face, and rather like Stuart, they've enjoyed the face-to-face contact, but trying to guide them towards their college places so they don't become neat has been a big piece of work for us. And the final slide, please. And then throughout the other bit we've done is business as usual. So we have 6 centres for the primary behaviour service. Our staff, our teachers in those have turned up every day. They've had children in every day. They've been some of the most tricky, vulnerable students, and they've dealt with them superbly well throughout. And then the teams that Philip manages at Swanwick Lodge, Lee House, Bluebird and Austin, mental health, and Place for Learn, which is our virtual learning environment. Again, staff all been working gainfully throughout the COVID pandemic to ensure that those children got continued education on a face-to-face basis. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I added an extra slide, Steve, didn't I, about next steps. Sorry, this one wasn't in your pack, members, but I thought you'd want something on kind of next steps. So obviously we all got the guidance last Thursday. We've read it, schools have read it, and we're now working gainfully with schools to open for September. Some of the tensions I thought you would be interested in, some of the dialogue we're currently getting into is, first of all, there is a tension between, some of this is secondary particularly, the size of bubble and the size of a potential lockdown. So if you're in a secondary school, what you've got is kids don't just have one class teacher, they have 7 or 8, a history teacher, they go to the science labs, if you have the size of bubble to be a whole year group, potentially if you have 2 or 3 confirmed cases, you are then sending the whole year group home. If you make your bubble even larger than that, potentially you're sending even more children on. So we're working through that tension about flexibility for staff with the size of bubble versus the size of the potential lockdown. Another tension that we're all looking at is zoning. So it is possible to take a secondary school and say, The maths block is for year 7, the English block is for year 8, the science blocks are for year 9, and to do it that way. Obviously, what that then does is it limits access to specialist spaces. So again, there's a tension between zoning and access to specialist spaces we're working through. Additional furniture, both primary and secondary schools are looking at additional furniture. You'll know the guidance says kids have all got to be looking forwards at the whiteboard. That is a bit tricky when all your tables are round. So some schools are looking at purchasing some rectangular tables to enable that to happen. We're working, and schools are working at the messages they want to send out before the end of term to try and garner as much parental confidence as in place. And they're thinking, where do they go with the government's messages over fining for children that don't attend? Some of the behavioural intervention will be a bit more challenging in September because we are going to be using every single space in all schools, and some of the small spaces that you might typically use for behaviour intervention might be being used for other things, so that's causing some angst and some thinking. Last two things. One of the bits that we're looking at is some children are persistently absent from schools in ordinary times. Some of those children have just had, they will have lost by the end of term about 75 days of schooling. They might not be the most eager children at trying to get back. So what strategies are we going to employ to get some of the children that are reluctant learners back into school? And then finally, the last piece of work we're doing is to strengthen the home learning offer. And it has to be able to, and schools have to be capable in the event of a local lockdown of moving online really rapidly. And that's particularly true for year 11 children. Year 11 have obviously got their GCSEs this coming year. If they lose 4, 5, 6 weeks because of a local lockdown, we've got to get the learning online really rapidly, and it's got to be high quality. Otherwise, that group of children will be disadvantaged in their GCSE. So I thought you'd be interested in some of the tensions that have come out since last Thursday. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to move this on. We've got Pete's going to do a couple of slides on the capital programme and how that's being rolled out, because work is still going on this. So, Pete, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning, members. If I could just quickly say that absolutely delighted by the work of the team, our property colleagues, but really very importantly, the contractors, because they've adapted very well to the challenges of COVID and working with what Brian and Stuart have said, working above and beyond. So the first slide, Steve's moved us on, but the first slide actually that I was going to show you, just to flag, was the Oakmoor Secondary School, former Mill Chase, and that's part of the transformation programme, as you know, of Borden Whitehill area. And I'm really pleased to say that last month we received notification that it's been shortlisted for an RIBA award. So good, positive news there. Next slide, please, Steve. So the first opening in terms of our capital programme, the major construction projects and all of our major sites have remained in operation, and the limited number of contractors that suspended work are now back progressing. So all construction sites are adhering to the government guidance, which currently states construction can continue where it's done in line with public health guidance. So at the start of COVID, a few of our sites did close, but that was only to review their health and safety plans, and then they reopened. I'm pleased to say now that all of the sites are open and all contracts are being very carefully and closely monitored. In terms of the non-essential school repair and maintenance work, at first that was suspended, but projects are now restarting. And all schemes are being reviewed on a case-by-case basis. And when we're comfortable about being able to undertake the work safely, we will commence that work, obviously working closely in coordination with head teachers and governing bodies. And the two images that are shown on that slide show you there Barton Farm, which is the school that I'm really pleased to say handed over the building last week, and the new school at Stoneham Park in Eastleigh. Next slide, please, Steve. So this slide shows you two images, again, recent images of projects currently under construction. That's the Austin Academy in Basingstoke and Deer Park Secondary in Botley. So productivity, we accept, is likely to be slower than before the crisis, but we're currently managing budgets and timelines within the contingencies that we originally set for the individual schemes. So the Austin Academy, as you see, scheduled for an April 21 completion. In actual fact, that scheme is just ahead of time. And the Deer Park Secondary School, which is scheduled for September 21, is still on track to deliver for that, albeit tight. So we're working very closely with the industry to try and minimise the impact. But clearly, should there be a second lockdown, that could have an impact on those dates. All schools and their governing bodies are being fully consulted about the scope of work, and we've spent extensive meetings and times working with them. And I'm pleased to say that all of the new school places schemes, so those basic need projects that are on schedule for delivery for September, will deliver, and we will have those places available at the beginning of September. We're in weekly conversation with the DFE, their capital directorate, to give the DFE an insight as to what's happening on the ground, and continuing to always make the case for more cash for Hampshire, as you'll be pleased to hear. So just a few quick last 4 bullet point headlines for you. Over the last 18 months, the programmes included 40 major investment schemes, a number multi-million. They're currently on site or have recently completed. Detailed MDA negotiations for Horton Heath, Manydown, Waterside, Wellbourne and Whiteley. 2013 to 2020, we would have built an additional 19,100 school places, with the team supplementing the capital for that with £156 million worth of secured developer contributions. And we're currently working on the potential for a further 38 new schools to serve new housing developments that are scheduled to start in the next 10 years. Finally, you will have heard about the government announcement of the £1 billion for a school rebuilding programme, plus an additional 560 million this year. We're working to understand the detail of that with the DFE and understand that specific details will be announced in the autumn spending review. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move us on then to the last section, which is from Suzanne. And Suzanne, I think we've given the early years stuff in this presentation a fairly good going over already. So I think perhaps deal with that very lightly and just focus on the other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of my branch, similar to my colleague, very little activity was suspended or stopped. Business as usual, but doing it differently. So the few areas that we did pause on were around some of our statutory data returns, which were suspended by the Department for Education. The local government ombudsman suspended complaints processes for some time. So we stopped that work, and some of our tender processes that were active at the point of lockdown. Obviously, as providers furlough significant numbers of staff, it didn't seem sensible to continue with those. But other than that, everything kind of kept going in my part of children's services. We did quite a bit of work in the early days following the government guidance around what payments should and shouldn't be made to providers. Did some work within the department to make sure that those payments that should be made were, but also that we protected the council funding where that was necessary. The areas that are most significantly affected in my branch were early years and homeschool transport. And as Steve said, I'll skim over the early years stuff. So next slide, please, Steve. In terms of homeschool transport, I won't dwell on this slide. It just gives you a little bit of context around what it looked like pre-COVID and what it looked like during lockdown. As you'd expect, significant numbers of children not attending and not requiring transport. But some interesting messages in there around the financial support that we deliver to the sector. We sometimes in the transport world, we've got different sets of guidance. We have the Department for Transport providing guidance around kind of public bus and rail, and then we have the Department for Education advising on homeschool transport, and that did lead to some differences in terms of the financial support available for that sector. Next slide, please, Steve. In terms of home to school transport now, these numbers haven't changed significantly. So the 1st of June return, we had 550 eligible children who could be transported, and 110 of those are getting the transport that they need to attend school at this point in time. And as Year 10 returned on the 15th of June, we're transporting around 273 of the eligible children at the moment. You'll be aware that capacity on vehicles is significantly reduced as a result of the social distancing measures that are necessary. So it's only about 15 to 25% of capacity in any vehicle that we can actually utilise at the moment. So whilst at the minute we are able to provide transport to all children who need it, depending on guidance that we are still awaiting, we may have some challenges come September as all schools return. Next slide, please, Steve. Just thinking ahead around home to school transport, just so that members are aware, we still haven't had guidance on home to school transport for the September return. And there is a suggestion, or really we need to be working individually with each school to try and work out how we might be able to support their thinking around, how they're bubbling children. Practically, there aren't enough vehicles to support the kind of optimum position, I suppose, of a vehicle for each bubble. As you know, transport is organised based on geography and not by the age or phase of the child. So we're doing lots and lots of work over the next week or so to try and work with as many schools as we can before they break up to establish, their thoughts around September and how we can support them with that. But we do still await the final guidance. We're now seeing the transport sector largely back from furlough, so that helps in terms of our ability to look at how we move forward. And we do have some concerns about parts of the sector, but they're not widespread. We are likely to offer more parental mileage allowances. So, the government guidance is quite clear that where parents can take children to school, it would be really great if they could. And we are offering eligible families a mileage allowance instead of transport. We've had an increase of 20 or so families so far, but we are likely in the next few days to write out to all SEN eligible families, asking if they would like to consider that for September, even if it's just for the first term. Next slide, please, Steve. Whilst we were in lockdown, we had the primary admissions round. Again, I won't go through all of this detail. You'll be aware that we had a successful primary admissions round with just under 98% of parents being offered a Year R place for their child in one of their 3 preference schools. We made some very rapid changes to the way in which we administer those applications so that we could take some of the pressure off schools, but also ensure that we were compliant with the government timescales around the admissions offer day. Admissions appeals are ongoing. There has been temporary legislation introduced to help us to administer those, and the County Council has taken the decision to hold paper-based panels rather than virtual panels. And like I say, those are ongoing at the moment. Next slide, please, Steve. In terms of early years, you'll have seen this in your pack, so I will move on very quickly from that one. So, and likewise, we've gone through that one. Main thing to draw your attention to is within 24 hours, we did create that brokerage service for families and providers to help ensure that nobody went without childcare who needed it. Next slide, please, Steve. And just the latest numbers. So this was at the point of publishing these slides. I can update these verbally for you now. So as of the 2nd of July, we had 576 group providers open and 65 closed. So good increases in group provision. For the school-based providers, we had all open and none of them were closed. And for the childminders, we were up to 616 who were open and 106 who were closed. We've got over 9,000 children now back in childcare. 3,900 of those are the children of critical workers and 524 of those are vulnerable children. And then again, we've gone through this in some detail in the previous report, so I won't dwell on it here. Thank you very much.
There we go. And apologies, it took a while to get through it, but some important stuff in there. So we're very happy to take questions from here on in. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We will dive straight in with questions. Councillor Anne Briggs, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for such a comprehensive report. And mainly, I would just like to give my thanks to all officers and staff for how hard you have worked to protect our children in Hampshire. I think the reports speak for themselves. But I would like to ask Stuart, how are we recruiting prospective foster carers in this difficult time with COVID? And my second question is, when we will be able to open our 2 other children's homes?
Thank you, Councillor. In terms of foster carers, I'm optimistic actually as to the position. One of the things that we've seen with Adopt South, so our regional adoption agency, is the numbers of requests to be considered to be adopters has gone up significantly over the last three months. And we think that's because people are at home thinking about their own family circumstances, perhaps taking a slightly different approach to their life and longer term. And we want to use some of the lessons for that in terms of our recruitment to foster carers. It hasn't stopped, is what I would say. We've still been using social media. We've still had inquiries about becoming a foster parent, and we've still started the assessment process. So it hasn't ground to a halt, and I'm optimistic that the sort of change in people's thinking about children and their lives and communities generally will bear fruit into the autumn. The second question was around our 2 children's homes. So for those members that may not be aware, to ensure that we have enough resilience across our residential estate to keep Swanwick Lodge going, our secure unit, and other children's homes, we agreed to temporarily close 2 of our homes, and it is only temporarily. They had very few children. In fact, there were 3 children in total across 2 homes, and they already plans for them to move on to other places. So it was a sensible and pragmatic step to prepare for the pandemic and to increase our resilience. We are looking at this moment now in terms of reopening those homes. I suspect realistically it's going to be September, October. At the back of my mind is, might we need to go into lockdown again? We might not, and we hope not. But if there's a second peak, what I don't want to do is keep moving staff around. So at least until September, which is really not that far away now, we intend to keep the homes closed. But after that, we'll be seeking to open them up again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. May I just make a very quick comment?
Go on.
Thank you. I think our social workers have been amazing, what they have done with the children and the innovative ways they have worked. It's just one case that a child couldn't visit. They couldn't obviously have visits from their parents. And the social worker arranged that the parent should read the child a good night story. But she also bought 2 books so that the foster carer could read stories the other night that the parents couldn't. And I just think that shows what great workers we've got. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Can we have Councillor Malcolm Wade, please?
Thank you, Chairman, and these are definitely questions. First of all, I'd like to say actually that thank you for that report. It just shows what a hard work and how this council has adapted to the very challenging situation we've had for our children's services. So that's all very good. 2 of the questions I've asked earlier on in the crisis, and I want to have an update in it. The first one is for Stuart, and I've got 2 for Brian. For Stuart, I would like to ask, in our because mental health is a big issue, there's a lot of mental health problems come out of the lockdown itself. How have our most vulnerable looked after children been with this lockdown? I know earlier on we seem to be managing it quite well. There's some problems. Now we're further down the lockdown. How has that panned out? Have we got more issues? Is there more problems?
Thank you, Councillor Wade. Remarkably well is how it's panned out, I would say. I can give a really good example. So at the beginning, as we went into lockdown, we had 11 foster carers who were saying, when lockdown finishes, and they were all teenagers, this teenage young person, we don't think we can meet their needs. They're too complicated and they're too challenging. And so after lockdown eases, we'd like them to move. As of last week, that number had reduced from 11 to 2. And the reason it had reduced is because what's happened is lockdown has enabled some of those relationships to be cemented and developed. And foster carers have really worked hard, as have the social workers, in helping manage young people's anxiety. And they've done whatever it's taken to manage that anxiety. And I think there's a difference, and I say this a lot, between mental health issues and a formal mental health diagnosis and emotional well-being. And the majority of our children in care experience poor emotional well-being. They don't have a diagnosed or diagnosable mental health illness. And so I think it's the emotional well-being that we're able to work with and support. And we do that. We have CAMS workers who have been accessing children, have been able to offer them therapy sessions. Things haven't stopped, and it's a really important point. We've just done it differently, Councillor Wade. So I think all in all, I would say remarkably well is how those children who are most vulnerable have coped. I would say this because it's right and proper that there are a small, very small cohort of teenagers with challenging behaviours who have found the social distancing and the whole lockdown difficult, but they have been really in single figures, I would say, and we've had to work hard with all of our partner agencies to make sure that they've been safe. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. That's very reassuring to hear that. Now, I've got two questions for Brian Sherman, if that's okay. The first one is that schools, a bit like the early years thing, many of them have very fragile economies at the moment. And there was I think it was on the questions and answer for head teachers, that if schools incurred extra cost being open during the Easter holidays for special, key workers' children, they will be able to possibly get the money back from government. I'd like to know whether government is going to divvy up on that promise. That's question number one. Question number two, and they didn't prepare for this one really, but Brian did the slide about September, and I should take an interest. I'm a governor on a LEA secondary school, and we went through the government guidance and realised that's a bit of a challenge, to put it mildly. You talked about the bubbles, but the specialist the teachers with the specialist subjects will have to go from bubble to bubble to do that. It's not like in a primary school where one teacher can probably teach most of the topics. I noticed in the presentation you didn't mention that fact, and I just wonder, is there any mitigation guidance, or really is it just left for the schools to manage it themselves? And I think the school accepts that's what they're going to have to do. But as you didn't mention that point, look, there are many weaknesses in the government guidance, and that clearly is another one. I just wondered if you wish to comment on that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wade. Just to add to Stuart's point about the vulnerable, the looked after children, the other bit we've found is that over half of those have been attending in schools. And what schools are reporting, because they've had smaller groups of children in over the pandemic, children from vulnerable backgrounds have had access to some small group work, and they're finding that that's forged really strong relationships with those children between staff and students, and therefore stands us in really good stead, we think, for September. So that's an interesting thing that schools have fed back to us. In terms of additional money, what the government have said to schools is I think primary schools can claim up to £25,000 per school for additional costs associated with COVID. Secondary schools can claim up to £75,000. There are limits on what they can and can't claim for, and we're currently working with schools. There's a deadline for them to submit their first claim, I think by the 21st of July. And I know our finance team are working gainfully with schools to try and make sure that those claims go in. In addition to that, the government announced £1 billion for what they're calling catch-up funding 350 million of that are going to the Education Endowment Foundation for one-to-one tutoring, 650 million going direct to schools. As it stands up today, we don't know how much each school will get and how that's going to be distributed, but that's additional money going into schools. With the specialist teacher, Councillor Wade, absolutely accept that's an issue. What we're finding is that what secondary heads are wanting is a conversation with us about those matters rather than issuing more guidance. They're kind of guidanced out at the moment. They've had so much guidance from the DFE. What they want is a conversation. And without a doubt, some teachers are going to have to move from bubble to bubble. I know larger secondary schools are saying, let's split our English team up. We've got an English team of 10 teachers. 2 will go in with year 7, 2 in with year 8, 2 in with 9, 2 in with, and so on. That's harder for some of the more specialist subjects like arts, where you might only have 3 teachers. And in those circumstances, the teachers are going to have to teach more than one bubble.
Okay, thank you for that response. Yeah, it is a challenge.
Can we have Councillor Jackie Branson, please?
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of things. Obviously, I think we ought to actually accept how well our head teachers and all their senior leadership teams and all the teachers who've done homeschooling have done. But I would like to add a special thanks to all the people that helped with the provision in schools, and many of those were the learning support assistants, the site teams, the chefs, the canteens. You know, these people aren't very well paid, and I'm just wondering what we have done, what we might do to acknowledge what they have done through this to keep that provision open, even through the school holidays. I mean, at Crookhorn, they didn't close at all, except for, I think, one bank holiday. I think they're all in need of a holiday, to be honest. So that's on the first question. And the second question on school admissions, we had a slight problem that admissions weren't talking to the SEN teams. And obviously we'd given all our places out, and when suddenly the SEN teams came up with 2 children with HCPs that had parental choice to come into the school. And this is going to be a problem with accepting them, you know, and the fact that we've already accepted over the number that we expected, because we expect 1 or 2 children not to turn up. And we've also got 14 tribunals to look at, which is actually causing a lot of problems on school admissions at our school. So I acknowledge that I should have mentioned that I was a chairman of governors of a secondary school, and also would like to also thank as a grandmother of a reception child, how well that they have done in primary schools as well. So,
can I say, in terms of recognition, school staff have been magnificent throughout this. They've not been found wanting at all. We have sent letters out from Councillor Chad to be shared with all staff. Steve has written out to all staff to be shared with all staff. I have. There's another letter that is going out in Steve's name before the end of term as well. So we've tried to keep the thank yous going, but obviously we can't say it often enough that school staff have been magnificent.
Absolutely.
With regard to the admissions issue at your school, what I'd ask you to do is just to send me that in an email so that I can look at it, because obviously I don't know the detail. It's difficult for me to respond.
Thank you.
Councillor Gavin James, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got one question for Stuart, one for Brian. On social care, somebody goes around and makes assessments on people on a regular basis. There is some stuff that's really quite good about digital working and virtual working, and some stuff that's absolutely awful. Catching up with a known client is actually quite a good thing to do. Assessing someone you've never met before is an absolute nightmare. It's really important, I think you reflect this in your report, that we kind of make sure we keep the best of it, but don't end up keeping the worst of it. But it's difficult to know how you're going to do that. Obviously, we're only sort of halfway through. We've got some ideas. So really the question is, will there be a sort of a deeper dive staff survey at some point to really understand on the ground how this is going down and what's working well and what's not working well, and how do we make sure that we keep best practice and don't get kind of pushed into adopting cheap practice because of the economic climate we're just about to go into.
No, a brilliant question, and you're right. What we're trying to do is to.
That was a Stuart.
Sorry.
Yeah. Brian's question, if I put that so you can think about it. I'm really quite shocked that right now I can go to the pub, but my son can't go to school. I think we had Nightingale hospitals popping up within minutes. We had buying lots of medication that didn't work. And for schools, I really think they've been treated like the poor relation. We know throughout summer there's been no festivals, no weddings, all these marquees that would have been fantastic outdoor classrooms were all sitting there, would have been available. We've got cinemas that have been sitting empty that could have been made good fun classrooms. We couldn't have recreated the full school week, but we could have made sure every child had something if the will was there from government to provide you with the tools to do that. So from Brian, the question will be is what more could government have done? Because we were talking now about them offering some funding. Too late, this should have been instant. We should have been talking about this early April. How do we provide something for schools? My son's going to be out of school for 6 months. I think that's appalling. And we've been failed by the government. And I'd welcome Brian's thoughts on how the recovery can be quicker. But obviously, Stuart first.
We'll do the questions in the order that they came. So what I would say is across the whole department, we're having a very open and very ongoing conversation about, and particularly in Stuart's slides, actually, you'll have seen some reflection on what worked well and what didn't work so well. And we're not, I want to reassure you, we're definitely not oblivious to the what doesn't work well, because there are some things you need to smell, you need to feel, you need to work out, you need to be in a house to actually understand what's going on. But Stuart, do you have anything you want to pick up from that?
Well, I'll just do perhaps the opposite of that, the things that we think do work really well. Social workers have been telling me loud and clear that older teenagers sitting in a room with them face to face is not always the best way to get information from them. They don't like the eye contact, it can be quite intense. Same for some of our parents as well, particularly with some of the sensitive issues that we're discussing. So almost certainly we will maintain some of the virtual visits, particularly for those ongoing relationships. But I think your point's really well made about assessments. It's an area that has been flagged with me already, and we'll explore it more. I think I said when I was going through the presentation, you need to have a lot of confidence in your assessment of risk. And you can't always get that by just doing it via WhatsApp. You have to go and you have to be in the child's shoes is the phrase that I use, and that you can't do that so easily via technology. So those conversations, I can assure you, those conversations have already happened and will continue to happen. And I think it will be an iterative process that we emerge into a new way of doing things longer term.
Okay, and on the second one, before Brian comes in, it's not really, we're not really in a position to give a critique of the government's timing on issues because we're not party to the scientific advice that they had. And so I think that's one that would come out in a future review of how this has been handled or and so on. So I can't really offer a view on that. And we've been very, very careful deliberately the joke is that I've got a B in biology in an O level, so I don't feel qualified to overrule the government's chief scientist. So we've deliberately said, well, the government advice is this, so we follow the government advice. And but what we can probably critique is about what would be helpful in the next steps. So we're probably focused on that, and there has been some movement on some of those points. Do you want to pick up the story from there, Brian?
Yeah, I do. Just to add on the what doesn't work well, because that's been interesting in education as well, and some of the online techniques we've used, when the children have actually been coming back into school, we haven't found that the learning has stuck. So particularly things like use of Teams and Zoom, you might think superficially that there's a lot of attractions to that, but it doesn't allow for really successful, high-quality peer-to-peer interaction, and it doesn't enable, in a whole class situation, really great feedback. So that's one of the bits that we're learning from. In terms of the government's response throughout this, it's not been about accommodation, it's not been about extra classrooms necessarily. The limiting factor, and again, we bow to the Chief Scientific Advisor, has been that bubble size cannot be more than 15, and in Hampshire classes are 30. So if you split every single class in two, you need twice as many teachers. In Hampshire, we've got 10,000 teachers, and with the best will in the world, we haven't got access to 20,000 teachers. So it's been the bubble size that has been the limiting factor largely in Hampshire.
Thank you. Just to make members aware, due to the time constraints, we are going to postpone item 9, the Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Reform Update Report. When we come to discuss the work programme, we will talk about additional meetings then. So we'll go back to questions now because I know we've still got some hands up, but just to let you know. If I can return to questions, Councillor Michael Westbrook.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just like to, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, just to reiterate what others have said, really. I mean, the comprehensive report by everybody on this is excellent. If you take the time to read the whole report, there's an awful lot of detail in there, and you can see how much work's been done by everybody. And my hat goes off to everybody, the fantastic way they've, staff and volunteers have adapted and stepped up to what has been a really difficult crisis. My brief question really is, Brian mentioned about home learning and the laptops that were provided through the DFE to year 10s, but I wanted to focus on Stuart's slide on page 41, where he's talking about working with how we work with children and families with technology. Were there situations, Stuart, where the technology was not available in the family setting, and have we been able to assist with that? That was my question.
Thank you. Yes, there were occasions where families didn't have access to the right equipment. I remember one particular example being a family where we were going through court proceedings, and we did make equipment available to families insofar as we could. And many of the laptops were not just for year 10. We had, I think it was around about, and Brian's probably got the exact number, I think it was around about 3,000 for vulnerable children. And we issued those to those families we knew where there was a particular issue around accessing technology. If we couldn't use virtual, then we did it in face-to-face. And I go back to, sort of commending my staff for doing that. They would obviously take precautions. We had visits through the window, we had visits in the garden, we had lots of different ways of doing that. But if necessary, they went into family homes. I think it raises a wider issue, actually, and it's something that I had a conversation about with some inspectors from probation very recently about the divide for those very vulnerable and disadvantaged children who genuinely don't have access to technology, or where the families can't afford the Wi-Fi and the broadband. That potentially creates an issue, and it's something collectively as society we need to perhaps think about longer term, because it has shown the inequity at times. We've managed to deal with it, but I think it's a wider issue.
Can I just come back briefly, Chair? I wholeheartedly agree with what Stuart said, and I think there is another side to this as well in relation to the data and broadband, and we might provide, I know there's organisations that are refurbing laptops for people that need it and dishing them out, but it's where you come to having the data that's available. I mean, you could roll it out into library services, more books have been downloaded, but how do you do that if you haven't can afford the data or the packages if you're a vulnerable family? And I think that is something that's worth discussing, across society and as a council. Thank you.
Can we move to Councillor Fran Carpenter, please?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Two pieces of work that came to my attention over COVID from our department were fantastic. One was by Moira Smythe, and she was doing podcasts for the children in care, and Councillor Wade and Briggs and I took part in that. That was very early on. Seems like years ago now, but it was very good. Also, the music service, I just wanted to mention particularly. I was in contact with Jill Lana, the head of the service, and at the time, a few weeks ago, when I spoke to her, there had been 2,500 music lessons taught online. Fantastic videos, collaborations with military bands, all the orchestras and groups getting together. And if you can still find all those on Twitter and Facebook, I just wanted to say that because it was just out of this world, and I hope people saw those things pop up on Facebook. But my questions, one about GCSEs. How do the teachers judge the grades of GCSEs? I'm not, I wonder if there'll be a bit of positive bias, which is fine. I don't know. I'd just be interested to know how teachers will do that. And also, even though schools are best for many children, of course, I just wonder, are we anticipating more parents will apply for home education to home educate? Thank you.
I think you're muted, Brian.
I was hoping somebody wasn't going to ask me the GCSE question because it's quite complicated. Teachers' judgments are only playing a part in the judgments of what each child will get in their GCSEs. And if you want my honest view, I think it's quite a small part. So we're not collecting results from schools this year because what they will be is the same as last year. So what they are looking at is if children got a level 5, for example, in their Key Stage 2 results, and they then attended Wilden School, what they're looking at is how many children that got a level 5 at Wilden, at their primary school, then went on to get a grade 9, a grade 8, a grade 7. So what they're going to do is to use an algorithm based upon what children got in their Key Stage 2 results and the progress that their current school has added in recent years to give them a grade. What they've got from teachers, which is helpful, is a sense check as to where the teacher thinks they should have got. But more importantly, what they've got is a list of children by where they think they would have ended up in their hierarchy with their peers. So if there are 300 children in a maths cohort, who would have come first, got the best mark, second, third, fourth, And what they'll do from that is make sure that, say, 10% of the school last year got a grade 9, that only 10% get a grade 9 this year. So that's how that will be worked out. So it'll be less to do with teacher judgments and more to do with an algorithm as to previous schools' results. With the EHE, I think that's too challenging to ask at this point. I think none of us really know. I suspect we've got some parents, Councillor Chad perhaps included, that really can't wait to get their children back in school and actually will be more appreciative of teachers' efforts in future. Equally, I think we've got some parents that have quite enjoyed the experience. The bit I'd say to you is please remember with the EHE cohort that it moves very rapidly. Children on average can only go electively home educated for 3-4 months and then they go back into school again in Hampshire. So it's not the same children all the time that are EHE. So we may well see some of that in September.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Powell-Hare, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to echo the comments made by councillors thanking Hampshire County Council officers, social workers and head teachers and teachers during the lockdown times. It's been very, very challenging, as we all know. And I think everybody's pulled together and given lots of support. One of my questions, actually, Franz just touched on, is about home education. I've been speaking to lots of parents, and there has been a lot of anxiety, a lot of mental issues, and some parents will go to homeschooling. I just want to know what sort of support that we will be giving them.
We have a small electively home educating team, and they undertake the statutory functions. But obviously, if you choose to electively home educate, what you are in effect doing is saying, I will be responsible for the education of my child, and I will provide a suitable education. So our job, the statutory function of the local authority, is to assess whether or not it is suitable or not. And if a parent is not providing a suitable education, we can impose an attendance order to try and get them back into school. There is lots of support out there for parents who choose to electively home educate amongst the electively home educating community, with lots of information and resources that are online. And there are electively home education groups in Hampshire that all support each other as well.
Thank you. Councillor Jackie Porter.
Thank you. In the analysis on, well, first of all, I have said already, and I will continue to say thank you to the teams, every single team, every single person has done an amazing job, and it's been really hard. But in the analysis of, through actually the food partnership in Winchester, one of the things that's come forward is the analysis of those who needed help most were broadly families with several children who were on the edge before lockdown. And in many cases, they were also single parents too. And I wanted to ask Stuart, how many children moved from being children in need right through the child protection scheme, right through to children looked after, not just in Winchester, but obviously right across Hampshire? And the other aspect is, how do you think we could improve the free school meals offer and the school transport, school transport going forward, but the free school meals offer during the summer? Are we confident that those children will actually be well fed through the summer? I realise it's not purely a school problem, but it's often administered through schools. And then thirdly, we're advising parents to take children to school themselves if they can. But if they've got children in different directions, what role can the county council play in trying to make sure all those children get to school, particularly if they are vulnerable and in larger families?
So I'll thank you for the question. I'll start with the first question, then I'll hand it back to my colleagues who will have provide more detail. What I can't, off the top of my head, give you the exact numbers that have moved from early help through into children in need, through to child protection. And I'm very happy to do that separately if you require the exact numbers. What I can do though is talk to you about the changes that we've seen over the last 3 months. So typically and it was on the slide, our referral numbers at this time of the year would be around about 800 to 820. Over the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've seen numbers around 930 up to just over 1,000. So we are seeing, as I said before, the demand for children's social care services. Our early help services did not stop. Just like social care, it was business as usual, but doing it differently. What we have seen is an increase in the complexity of cases that have been coming to social care. So we typically would get what we call a large proportion of the referrals that come through would be lower level child in need work. What we've seen is higher level child protection work increasingly coming through. And our numbers of children on the child protection plan have risen for the first time in many years actually. And again, no surprise if I say this, our numbers of children in care have also risen for the first time in 18 months. Now, some of that is because children in care are not necessarily leaving. They might be turning 18, but it's not safe for them to go into independent accommodation in the middle of a pandemic. So that might artificially inflate the numbers of children in care. But I am confident in saying we have seen more children coming to care and more children on a child protection plan because of the complexity of the work that we're facing. I think I said, I may not have said this before, but we have seen more emergency protection orders and police protection orders in the last month than we've seen in the last 10 to 12. That's because families have reached crisis very, very quickly. And of course, other services have not been in situ. So a long answer, but in short, yes, we've seen a rise in children at risk on our child protection plan and children in care.
Can I ask a straight question? Is that because of neglect or violence?
It's a complicated picture. It is domestic abuse is a key issue, neglect is a key issue, mental health, adult mental health is a key issue, and substance misuse. It's what we call we're not allowed to call it toxic trio. It's the trigger trio, compounded by neglect. We've had some, I have to say this, some very, very difficult and challenging cases for our social workers to have to deal with.
Okay,
and I'll just chip in one thing that I know you know this, Councillor Porter, but neglect does not equal poverty, and poverty does not equal neglect. Yeah,
I'm not suggesting it.
Yeah, fine.
In terms of the free school meals questions, largely throughout the pandemic, schools have sourced free school meals from three areas. So those that have got a contract with our own internal catering company, HC3S have been producing thousands of free school meals, lunches on a daily basis, and making sure they've been getting out to schools. That system, I think, by and large, has stood up well. Some schools don't subscribe to our own catering company and have set up their own catering. Some schools have continued to use their own catering companies. Others have accessed the voucher system or set up local voucher systems with local supermarkets. For the summer, you'll be aware it's the Marcus Rashford voucher, isn't it? So each family that's currently entitled to free school meals will be given a voucher. Schools have got to put in those expressions to Edenred, who are the company that are organising that. I think, again, it's by the 21st of July. And we're encouraging schools to make sure that they've got those applications in so those families can get access to the vouchers over the summer period.
Can I just come back on that? That's fine, but of course, even if you're on universal credit, you're not entitled automatically to free school meals. And what we have found in Winchester, when we've been analysing who's been receiving free hot meals from through Salvation Army or whatever, it's actually families with multiple children, so more than 2 children, and therefore their income is not stretching to it, even though they're not entitled to free school meals. Have you any evidence from the Early Help Hub that this is actually a problem?
I think that's one for you, Stuart, Early Help Hub.
It is, and no, I haven't. That isn't an issue that's been raised with me. So I'm not aware of any evidence to suggest that.
I know that Home Start have referred a few people because of that to Early Help Hub.
Home Start have certainly been involved with some of this. The other bit, I would say, many schools have gone beyond the statutory free school meals and have sourced food as well from local supermarkets and other providers, and have been getting it out to families as well.
I'm just concerned for the holiday period for those who don't quite on the free school meals, but actually, have got a lot of children. I'll follow that up with Stuart separately. Thank you.
Thank you.
And school transport was the third one, really, for families with multiple children again.
Well, it's this is the Rubik's Cube that we're currently wrestling with, because you're right. It has had kids going to different schools, and advice from government which seems to be pointing us towards picking up pupils from within a bubble, but they may not be in the same villages or towns. It is, I think probably the best thing I can say is that we await further guidance from the DfE, which we're assured will be coming in the next week or so.
Because, of course, they'll all be probably going at different times as well as their secondary school. Yeah. Okay. TBC.
Yeah, quite. Thank you. Any other member who wishes to speak? If you just unmute. Pause. Yes, Peter, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. What a fantastic coming together today by everybody with this meeting today, and the answers that we have and the questions that have gone have been fantastic. I've been involved education at the County Council for 50 years, around 50 years. This is the biggest challenge there has ever been in our county. And I just cannot believe how well we've worked. And that's as a team, right through officers in particular doing we've been excellent leaders at every time we've needed it. Can I just particularly say a big thank you to Brian Pope and Steve Crocker, and you've met other people mentioned today. I would love to mention every single person, but to Brian and Steve, who I'd worked very closely here at the end of my time, and now I've spent in the last spent it this year actually impressed with everything we've achieved. So well done to everybody. Thank you very much indeed for today.
Thank you, Peter. I think I echo everyone in saying that we thank everyone and all their work within the Children's Service Department, because for the work they've been doing during this pandemic, because obviously it's been really interesting to hear how you've done it, but we all know how important that work is, so thank you. Any other member wishing to speak before we move to the recommendation? Just pause a minute. Okay, we will move to the recommendation then, which is that the Children and Young People Select Committee note the impact and response of the Children's Services Department to the COVID-19 pandemic, and there will be a poll populated for you in the chat.
Thank you, Chairman. The poll is now in the chat, ready for members to vote.
Thank you very much.
And that is majority in favour, so that's the recommendation is carried. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. In that case, we will move to item 8, which is the proposed changes to the post-16 Transport Policy Statement 2020. And this is a pre-scrutiny item, I believe. Steve, are you going to introduce us?
I'll just introduce it. And
Could
it's...
I just declare an interest, please, as a school governor? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is both incredibly complicated and incredibly simple in lots of ways. So we have a statutory duty to ensure children get to school, but that statutory duty becomes modified at post 16, and we produce a policy. We've had over the last couple of years, and there is those of you who have been on the committee for a while remember that there was a saving attached to the policy back in 2019. We've had some legal challenges to that policy over the years, over the last 2 years, and so we've brought it back through for a decision. That policy has been crawled all over by our legal team, a QC that we've engaged on the issue. We've also been through, as we're required to do, a consultation on it, and that's the bulk of the documentation in this. And we've amended the policy accordingly. For complicated reasons that again I can explain if needs be, the savings target is significantly reduced. That's primarily due to the changes in the way that the over 18s are now considered in this, which are essentially they used to fall within the adult social care remit, and they now fall within the homeschool transport remit. So whatever savings we could have made have now come back into us. We have to reconsider that. But essentially the policy is as outlined in the paper. So I don't know if Suzanne, if you want to add any more to what I've just said, or happy to take questions on the paper.
No, I think that was a similar introduction to what I was going to draw members' attention to. The report quite clearly sets out the changes that have been made following the latest kind of legal challenge. So there's clear identification of the bits that we have reviewed and amended, but also in the interest of time and the fact that the report, excluding the consultation response, is relatively short, would be happy just to invite questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Gavin James then, please.
Thank you, Chair. Given the pandemic and the real nobody quite knows what's happening to further education in September and the bubbles and all this kind of stuff, to be able to identify clearly which child could have their parent or which young adults could have their parent take them, who can access public transport, which may not be running at the time they're going to turn up because their bubble's going to education. Are we at a real risk that trying to introduce this policy at this stage, when none of us have a clue what further education look like, is perhaps a leap too far, and we should perhaps be looking to next year to bring this into place?
Yeah, it's a good question and a good point. The reality is that we have to have a legally compliant policy, so we can't not do it really. We've sort of been around that, so we do need to have a current policy.
The only thing I'd add to that is those students who are eligible for transport do have to apply every year. So it's a kind of repeating pattern. So it'll only be those new students coming through who already will have been informed that they need to apply as part of their college or further education application process.
Thank you. Councillor Jackie Porter.
It's on a similar basis, really. I appreciate that that is true, that people do have to apply every year, and that people know they're going to be applying for this year. But at the moment, they don't actually know what the arrangements at college will even be. So, although they know their family arrangements, they don't know their college arrangements. So, is it fair at this point? And I appreciate that what you're saying is that there is a policy that has to be in place. Okay, perhaps the policy has to be in place, but we maintain that sympathy to the ability to get children to school or to college and young people, because this is still a problem, because we do not know what the arrangements and what the hours will be of college, and they may vary during the year. How sympathetic will the County Council be to that particular issue?
Well, I think we clearly have to look at the world around us and what's happening, but we also there's a bit of this which is about you've got to plan for the worst and hope for the best, if you see what I mean, and so we have to have a plan in place, and we have to encourage people to make applications, and then we can work around that depending on what their particular circumstances are, and what the particular circumstances of the college are, which we may or may not know. At this moment in time, our anticipation is that we can only follow that government position, which is that colleges will effectively be open, but there will be issues around the timings of transport and how we get all those people together, as we've talked about previously, in terms of bubbles and so forth.
And we don't know really what the implication is for any younger children in the family that also have to be taken to school. That's so right. I think that's a concern, that this is quite a prescriptive policy, although accepting it's not as prescriptive as it was 5 or 6 weeks ago, but it's certainly, it does allow for that. But I think we're really concerned about making sure that young people get into college, particularly if they've been out of college or school since March.
This is not a COVID policy, if I can put it that way.
No, I know it's not.
Yeah. So the sort of COVID stuff overlaps onto this, and we'd have to make amendments and adaptations as we go forward in relation to COVID, as we have done with other bits of homeschool transport.
So can we be assured?
If you look at the under 16 homeschool transport and the SEN, we have a policy in place, again, which we then adapt to fit the COVID circumstances, and this, in my view, replicates that you have the standard policy, and then you overlay onto that whatever is needed to be done. And all of our evidence and experience on this so far tells me that will probably change, that latter bit, that COVID response. And we know that there's more guidance to come from government on homeschool transport due next week, and we will have to adapt according to that.
And frankly, are you confident that the points that have been, the challenges have been addressed in this response?
It doesn't matter whether I'm confident. What matters more, because I'm not a lawyer, rather like I haven't got, rather like I'm not a scientist. The point is that our legal advisors and the QC that we engage are satisfied that we've addressed the legal points.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other member wish to ask a question on this item? No, in which case, Councillor Jackie Porter, would you like to propose your amendment?
I would like, yes please, I'd like to propose this amendment. It may well have been covered in the answer just now, but I'd still think it's, I appreciate that we have to have a policy, so I don't believe that this actually is actually possible to propose in the light of the comment about having to have a policy. I'd like Steve could perhaps comment on that before I make that proposal, if that's possible.
Is this the one in the chat?
Yeah.
Hang on. In light of the uncertainty arrangements, sorry, it's just playing up. I can't.
I'd like to propose the amendment to this policy. In light of uncertainty of arrangements for the education arrangements for young people during COVID lockdown and into the new academic year, the Children and Young Persons Committee recommended the executive member the policy doesn't come into effect until September 21. Doesn't sound like it's legal. Lawful.
I don't think we could, from my perspective, we need an existing policy and a current policy in place. What can I say? It's not for me to make the judgment, but I think that would place us in an impossible position.
Steve, and Martin Goff here, I can say for certain we couldn't predetermine the 2021 policy without going through the annual process that is required. So certainly that aspect of moving it forward to 2021 would not be legal.
There you go.
In the light of that, then can we seek a scrutiny on the effect of this policy change within 6 months? That reason.
That's clearly a matter for you. I don't know whether 6 months gives you enough time. That's anything, because
well, yes, but you're going to have to start. If you don't, you'll have to start consulting on a new policy. Doesn't it?
I've certainly got no objections to that.
So could I propose an amendment then that the scrutiny actually seeks a review of this within 6 months, please?
I'm happy. Do you have a seconder?
Happy to second that. Okay.
Jackie, would you mind popping that amendment in the chat, or is that as an additional recommendation? Yeah. Thank you, and we can vote on that. Thank you, Councillor Porter.
Can we not just discuss this in the works programme? Because obviously that's what it is anyway.
We can, but it's already been proposed and seconded. So we will need to vote on it.
No problem.
Right, I can't spell committee. I've got one M. Hold on. It's very simple terms. I think that's what we're saying, isn't it? That's a recommendation.
Can I ask Councillor Westbrook, have you got a question on the amendment? You've got your hand up.
I have, Chair. I wasn't sure which amendment we're on now. So
the second.
It was around the first and the second. Really, I'm okay with this, with the second. But I think in relation to what was originally proposed, I mean, we understand we need a policy, but I think at the moment, that would have led to a lot of additional levels of complication at a difficult time. But also, I think what came out of the report to me as well is the fact that this point that each child needs are catered for, and I think that was what was paramount in that, and I think that was the legal challenge as well. So I think if we're looking to make sure that any child that has a problem that can't get what they need, that we're supporting them as a council, and I think that is the most important thing here, that we can adjust that straight away if we need to, and address that with each case as it comes forward. That was it, really.
Thank you, Councillor Westbrook. So can I just check with Democratic Member Services that are you populating a poll? You are, okay.
Hi, yeah, just to confirm that the vote for the amendment is just in the chat now.
Okay, and this is for a review in 6 months' time of the policy.
Can I just, as a technicality, I don't think we can review the policy in 6 months because we have to do it annually. But what I got from Jackie's submission was it was an update on the effects of the new policy within 6 months.
Yeah. Okay, so can we amendment to update in 6 months? It should say, but that's what we'll take it as.
It's about the effect of the policy. I think Councillor Westbrook and myself are actually both concerned that actually there was a difference in the parity of response from people earning under 20,000 to those earning above 20,000, and that also needs to be brought out, I think, when we review it. We will.
I mean, I have to say, from my perspective, I'm perfectly happy with the wording as you've used it, Councillor Porter. So
thank you.
That, if everybody's content that that's the wording.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that poll is in the chat now if members can vote.
Thank you, and that is a majority in favour, so that's carried.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll now move to the recommendation on your agenda, which is that the Children and Young People Select Committee consider and support the recommendations being proposed to the Executive Lead Member for Children's Services and Young People in paragraphs 2 and 3 of the attached report. So a poll will now be populated.
I should be voting for this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Confirm that's your vote.
Thank you, and that has just appeared in the chat. Thank you, and that is a majority in favour, along with Councillor Edgar's verbal approval, so that's carried. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Right, as we've postponed item 9, we'll move straight to item 10, which is our work programme. You will see in the agenda pack that the changes to the work programme are in red since our last meeting, and you'll obviously be aware that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we cancelled our May meeting. So I would like to propose that we have an additional meeting in September to cover the items that we do not have a meeting for, and to include the SEN item, which I've postponed from today.
Happy for that.
Great. I don't think we need a poll. If members are generally happy, then that's how we will proceed.
Agreed.
Agreed, yeah.
Agreed.
Brilliant,
Agreed.
thank you. So, Katie, can you just confirm if we need a poll for the recommendation?
Thank
Hi, it's Jackie. I don't think if everyone's in agreement with that, then I think that's absolutely fine, Chairman.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I've seen lots of nodding faces and heard agreement, so I will take that the recommendation has been agreed, that we agree the work programme, including the amendment for a September meeting. And just to thank everyone for your time this morning and participating, and to formally request the webcast is stopped, please.